There's a strange paradox about sleep. The nights you need it the most are usually the nights it refuses to come. The more you try to silence your mind, the louder it gets. You've probably been there, lying in the dark, scrolling, overthinking, bargaining with your own brain. Please, just let me switch off. Tonight, you're not going to fight your mind. You're going to befriend it. What if I told you that you don't need to stop thinking to rest deeply? That's the counterintuitive part almost nobody teaches. Your thoughts don't have to disappear for your body and heart to finally relax. In Zen Buddhism, the goal is not to turn off the mind, but to gently remember that you are more than your thoughts. And when you feel that, even for a moment, something in you starts to loosen, like a tight knot finally exhaling. You've heard all kinds of advice about sleep. No screens, no caffeine, no worries. But nobody talks about the stories you tell yourself when the lights are off. I'm behind. I'm failing. I can't handle tomorrow. These are the real monsters under the bed. Tonight, instead of being attacked by your own thoughts, you'll listen to gentle stories that slowly change the way you relate to them. Not by force, but by quiet recognition. Across these 3 hours, you won't hear lectures or impossible spiritual rules. You'll walk through simple and Tonsi-chan, human stories, rivers that teach you to stop fighting change, moons that explain why your energy rises and falls, wells that remind you there is a calm depth inside you even when the surface is chaos. You'll recognize yourself in these characters, in their anxiety, their confusion, and in the relief they discover when they finally stop running from themselves. Here's the quick reward. You don't need to do anything perfectly. You don't need to repeat mantras, sit straight, or even stay awake. Your only job is to get comfortable, listen with half an ear, and allow the words to wash over you like warm water. These teachings are not for your logical mind. They're for the part of you that knows, deep down, that peace has always been closer than it seems. Maybe you don't call yourself Buddhist. It doesn't matter. Zen stories were never meant to be locked inside temples. They were meant to walk with people in their ordinary, messy lives. People like you who are tired of feeling drained, anxious, and disconnected from themselves. People who don't want more information, but a different experience of their own mind. As you listen, you might notice something subtle. Your breath slowing down, your shoulders dropping a little, your thoughts becoming less sharp and more distant. You might fall asleep in the middle of a story, and that's not a problem. That's the point. These teachings don't need your full attention to work. They're like a soft hand resting on your back, reminding your nervous system, it's safe now, you can let go. So, if you're ready, find a position that feels kind to your body. Let the room be exactly as it is. You don't need silence. You don't need perfection. You just need this moment. In a few seconds, we'll step into the first story. And with each scene, each image, each breath, you'll be invited a little closer to something you've been searching for in 1,000 places. The deep rest that was always waiting quietly inside you. He had become a professional at saying, I'm fine. On the outside, his life looked organized, productive, almost admirable. He helped at work, helped at home, helped friends who were falling apart at 2AB. Inside, though, something was slowly fraying, like a fabric pulled too tight for too long. That's how burnout usually works. Not like an explosion, but like a leak. You only notice the flood when the floor is already wet. People loved that he was the reliable one. The boss knew he would stay late if needed. Family knew he would pick up the phone, no matter the hour. Friends knew he would listen, even when he had nothing left to give. And he believed that being a good person meant never disappointing anyone. The problem is, when you never disappoint others, you end up constantly disappointing yourself, quietly, in the dark. At night, when the house was finally silent, his mind did not rest. His body was exhausted, but his thoughts kept running checklists on repeat. Did I answer that email? Did I upset that person? Did I forget something important? The brain becomes like a manager who doesn't trust the team. It keeps rechecking everything over and over. His heartbeat was no longer just a rhythm. It felt like a reminder that he was always behind. The warning signs were subtle at first. He started forgetting simple things, like where he left his keys or if he had already replied to a message. His patience got shorter, not with strangers, but with the people he loved most. Tiny annoyances felt gigantic. A small delay in traffic felt like a personal attack from the universe. When the nervous system is overloaded, it doesn't ask for permission to misbehave. It simply does. Then came the night of the teacup. It was late, and he was washing dishes by himself, finally catching up on the day. His favorite cup was in his hand, the one he used when he needed a moment of peace. His grip slipped. The cup fell, hit the floor, and shattered into pieces. 3 large fragments and many tiny shards spread across the tiles. For a second, he just stood there, staring, feeling like that sound had cracked something inside his chest too. Unexpectedly, he sat down on the kitchen floor and started laughing and crying at the same time. It was just a cup, but it didn't feel like just a cup. It felt like a symbol of every time he had said yes when he wanted to say no. Every request he had accepted out of guilt. Every night he sacrificed his own rest to be available to someone else. Sometimes life uses a small scene to reveal a very big truth. The next day, he told an older neighbor about the broken cup. She listened quietly, with the kind of attention that feels like a warm blanket. Then she said, "You're a lot like that teacup. Everyone keeps pouring responsibilities, secrets, and expectations into you. But no one, including you, checks if you're already full." Her words hit harder than the cup hitting the floor, because he knew she was right. He tried to fix the problem the way most people do, with more organization. He bought a new planner, downloaded productivity apps, color-coded tasks. He thought, if I manage my time better, I'll be fine. But burnout isn't just a time issue, it's a boundary issue. A perfectly organized life will still collapse if you keep saying yes when your energy is screaming, "Please, not one more thing." So he began a simple experiment, a cup check twice a day. In the morning and in the evening, he would pause for 1 minute and honestly ask himself, from 0 to 10, how full am I right now? If the number was 8 or higher, he was not allowed to add new commitments that day. That meant sometimes saying, "Let me think about it and get back to you," instead of agreeing on the spot. A small pause like that can save an entire week of resentment. Of course, saying no did not feel natural. The first times he tried, his voice even shook. He felt selfish, dramatic, afraid of losing people's approval. But then he started to notice something interesting. The people who truly cared about him respected his new limits. The ones who got angry were usually those who were more interested in using his energy than in protecting his well-being. Boundaries have this magical effect of revealing who is really in your corner. To support this new way of living, he created a not-to-do list. On it, he wrote 3 personal rules. No answering work messages after a certain hour. No giving instant yes, always ask for time to check. No accepting guilt as a valid reason to overload. It looked simple on paper, but in practice, it was like learning a new language, the language of self-respect. He also started scheduling empty time the way he used to schedule meetings. He wrote things like Wednesday 7 p.m., nothing in his calendar, and treated it as a real appointment. During that time, he might read a gentle book, listen to soft music, or simply sit in silence with a cup of tea he actually had time to drink. These were not luxury moments. They were repairs. A nervous system doesn't heal in the 5 seconds between notifications. The more he honored his limits, the more present he became when he genuinely said yes. Instead of showing up half distracted and half exhausted, he arrived with real attention. When he listened to a friend, he wasn't secretly rehearsing tomorrow's tasks in his mind. When he helped at work, he made fewer mistakes and felt less resentful. People could feel the difference. His yes had weight again, because it was no longer automatic. Of course, he didn't become perfect overnight. There were weeks when he slipped back into old patterns, agreeing to too many things, ignoring his cup check, pretending to be a superhero again. And every time, the same symptoms returned: irritability, tension, that heavy feeling behind the eyes. Instead of judging himself, he learned to take those signs as reminders, not as proof of failure. Healing is not a straight line. It's more like a spiral that keeps revisiting the same lessons at deeper levels. One day, with a new teacup in his hands, he noticed something he had never thought about before. A cup is only useful because it has a boundary. Its value lies in the fact that it doesn't let everything spill. Without an edge, it would just be a puddle on the table. He realized he had been trying to live like a cup without sides, available to contain everything for everyone. No wonder he felt like he was constantly leaking. As he grew more aware of his own limits, he also became more sensitive to the overflow in his mind, especially at night. Lying in bed, he noticed how thoughts kept coming, one after another, like passengers arriving in an overcrowded station. It wasn't just his schedule that was overfilled, it was his inner world too. His cup was calmer, but his mind had become a train station that never closed. At night, when the world finally goes quiet, his mind often does the opposite. The body lies down, the room gets dark, but inside his head, the lights stay fully on. Thoughts arrive like trains entering a busy station. One about something he said years ago, another about bills, another about what could go wrong tomorrow. He doesn't choose them. They just come, honking loudly. And instead of resting, he spends the night running from platform to platform. He once described it to a friend like this: imagine trying to sleep in the middle of a crowded airport. There's always an announcement, a delay, a problem, a gate change. The airport is his mind. The flights are his worries. And even when he closes his eyes, the noise continues. What if I forget? What if they're angry? What if I fail? It's not that he likes worrying, it's that he doesn't know how to step away from the departure board. A wise teacher once told him, "Your mind is not the problem, your relationship with it is." At first, that sentence sounded like a riddle, but slowly he understood. The mind thinks like the lungs breathe, like the heart beats. Its nature is movement. Trying to force it to stop thinking is like yelling at a train station to shut down. The more you scream, the louder and more chaotic it feels. He had spent years trying to empty his mind before sleep. He tried forcing himself not to think, which only made him think more. He tried distractions, scrolling on his phone, binge-watching series, eating late at night. It worked for a few minutes, but then the trains came back, often faster. Distraction is like turning up the music in the station. It covers the announcements, but it doesn't stop the trains from arriving. One evening, an older monk gave him a different perspective. Imagine you are sitting on a bench in a train station, the monk said. Trains come and go. Some look interesting. Some look scary. Your mistake is thinking you must board every single one. That image stayed with him. For the first time, he realized, thoughts are invitations, not commands. Just because a thought arrives doesn't mean he has to go on the full journey with it. He began to experiment with this idea in bed. When a thought appeared, what if I mess up tomorrow? Instead of following it into 20 imagined disasters, he silently labeled it, anxiety train about tomorrow. When another thought came, I should have answered differently in that conversation. He labeled it, regret train. He didn't fight them, didn't push them away. He just noticed, like a station worker watching trains pass through. At first, this practice felt strange, almost too simple to work. His mind protested. But we need to think this through now. That's the trick of the mind. It always thinks night is the perfect time to solve everything. Yet, how many real solutions did he ever find at 2 p.m.? Most of the time, he just exhausted himself. So he made a deal with his mind. We will think about this tomorrow, when the sun is up and coffee exists. He also added a practical tool, a night notebook next to his bed. Whenever a thought came with that urgent tone of, don't forget this, he would write down a few words and close the notebook. It was like putting the train cargo in a warehouse for tomorrow. This simple act told his nervous system, it's safe to rest now. We're not ignoring life. We're just postponing it to a better hour. Over time, he started to notice patterns in his trains. There were rush hours, usually when he lay down after a day of ignoring his feelings. The trains of worry became louder the more he had pushed emotions aside during the day. It was like the station was trying to process all the delayed trains at once. This taught him something important. What you don't feel in the daylight tends to visit you loudly in the darkness. So he tried a new experiment, a 5-minute mental check-in before bed. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he would ask, what am I really feeling right now? Not what he should feel, but what was actually there. Sadness, frustration, fear, or maybe even relief. Naming the emotion out loud. I feel anxious about tomorrow's meeting was like announcing the train calmly through the speakers instead of letting it scream through the tracks. Sometimes he paired this with a very simple breathing practice. He would place one hand on his chest, one on his belly, and breathe gently, 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out. Not as a magic trick, but as a way of telling his body, we are not in danger now. The trains still passed, but the station became less chaotic. It's hard for a thought to control you when your body is steadily signaling safety. He also realized that not every thought deserved the same level of attention. Some trains were just old habits running their usual route. Self-criticism trains, worst-case scenario trains, what will people think trains. If a friend talked to him the way some of his thoughts did, he would never tolerate it. So he began asking, gently, is this thought actually helpful, or is it just noise? If it was just noise, he allowed it to pass without commentary. To make this even more concrete, he imagined each track in the station as a category. Track 1 was past mistakes. Track 2 was future fears. Track 3 was things I can't control. And track 4 was things I can do something about tomorrow. Only trains on track 4 were allowed to get his serious attention, and even then, only during daylight hours. Everything else was politely redirected. Wrong timing. Come back during office hours. As nights passed, something subtle but profound began to happen. The trains didn't stop coming. Minds are not designed to be empty, but he stopped rushing after all of them. He no longer felt like a hostage of every thought. Instead, he became something else, the one who watches. Like a quiet station master, he oversaw the traffic without being pulled away by every departure. There were still restless nights, of course. Some evenings, the station was wild, especially during big changes or painful moments in life. On those nights, rather than fighting the storm, he would whisper to himself, "It's okay that it's busy in here tonight. The mind is processing." That kindness toward himself made a huge difference. Fighting the mind for being active only adds another noisy train called, "I shouldn't be like this." Slowly, he discovered a peace that wasn't the absence of trains, but the presence of a deeper witness. Beneath the noise, there was a kind of quiet platform that never moved. Thoughts could roar past, fears could arrive and leave, but something in him remained still, watching it all. That stillness didn't shout. It didn't argue. It simply stayed. And once he touched it, even briefly, he realized he didn't need the mind to stop to rest. He just needed to stop chasing. And with time, as he became more familiar with that inner stillness, another question began to arise in him. If thoughts are like trains, and he is the one watching them, then who is this watcher? What is this silent presence that exists before the trains, between the trains, and even after they're gone? That question, quiet and powerful, would lead him toward a deeper understanding of who he really was beneath all the noise. He noticed something curious about his own emotions. They didn't arrive politely, one at a time. They showed up like weather, sudden storms, then sunshine, then clouds again. One bad message, and the whole day felt ruined. One kind word, and everything seemed possible. It was as if his inner world had no climate, only constant, unpredictable forecasts. And every time a wave came, he believed, "This is me. I am this storm." One afternoon, he went for a walk in a small park near his home. There was a pond there that he usually ignored, too busy scrolling his phone or planning the next task. But that day, his mind felt particularly messy, so he sat down on a bench and just stared at the water. The surface was calm, like a mirror. Trees, clouds, even a passing bird were reflected perfectly, as if the pond were quietly holding the whole sky. A little boy ran past and threw a stone into the water. Instantly, the reflection shattered. For a moment, it looked like the trees were broken, the sky torn, the bird deformed. But of course, nothing in the real sky had changed. Only the surface of the pond was disturbed. Watching the circles spread out, he felt something click. His mood works exactly like that, he thought. One event, one comment, and suddenly, my whole life is ruined. But is it really? He remembered how a simple text like, "We need to talk," could destroy his peace for hours. The mind would start, "What did I do? Am I in trouble? Are they angry?" That one stone of uncertainty created 1,000 ripples. Yet, if he looked honestly, nothing had actually happened yet. The situation was still just a sentence on a screen. The sky of his life was still intact. Only his surface was shaking. An older woman sat down next to him on the bench, someone he'd seen in the park before. She followed his gaze toward the water and smiled. Beautiful, isn't it? She said. This pond is like our mind. Everyone thinks they are the ripples. Almost no one remembers they are also the depth. He turned to her, surprised. It's funny how life sends a teacher wearing a simple jacket and comfortable shoes instead of robes. She picked up a small leaf and dropped it on the water. See that? She said. The leaf moves, the surface moves, but the depth stays still. Inside you, there is a place that doesn't shake every time your emotion does. You feel anxiety, but you are not only anxiety. You feel sadness, but you are not only sadness. You are also the awareness that notices all of this happening. Later that night, lying in bed, he tried to remember the pond. A worry appeared. What if tomorrow goes wrong? Immediately, the familiar tension started. But instead of wrestling with the thought, he closed his eyes and imagined the pond in the park. He pictured the surface, the reflection, the stone falling. Then, he gently said to himself, "Okay, there are ripples, but what about the water underneath?" He placed one hand on his chest and one on his belly, just feeling the rising and falling of his breath. For a few seconds, he didn't try to fix his life. He just noticed there is worry on the surface, and there is something deeper that is calmly noticing the worry. It didn't make the anxiety vanish, but it gave it a different context. Instead of being a storm inside a tiny glass, it became just wind over a deep lake. The next day, he started a simple practice. Every time a strong emotion arrived, instead of saying, "I am anxious," he practiced saying, "Anxiety is present." Instead of, "I'm a mess," he tried, "There is confusion in me right now." It seems like a small difference, almost just a play with words, but it changes everything. When you say, "There is anxiety here," it implies something bigger is here too, the you that can see it. He tested this at work, where ripples appeared all the time. An email with criticism, ripple. A delayed payment, ripple. A misunderstanding with a colleague, another stone into the pond. Whenever he felt his chest tighten, he would pause and silently think, "Okay, this is a ripple moment." Sometimes he even took 30 seconds alone in the bathroom, just breathing and visualizing the pond becoming calm again. To make it more practical, he created a ripple journal. At the end of the day, he wrote down 3 moments where he felt his inner water shake. Next to each one, he answered 2 questions. What actually happened? And what story did my mind tell about it? Often, the event was small, a tone of voice, a short reply, but the story was huge. They don't respect me. I'm failing. I'm not enough. The journal showed him how often the story was louder than the fact. He also noticed that some ripples were really old. A small comment in the present would wake up a huge wave from the past. A teacher's criticism from childhood, a parent's harsh words, a moment of humiliation he never really processed. The pond had memory. The stone thrown today was landing in water that still carried echoes of decades ago. No wonder some reactions felt bigger than the situation in front of him. Instead of judging himself, he began to practice gentle curiosity. When a reaction felt exaggerated, he would think, this ripple seems older than this moment. What does it remind me of? Sometimes a memory surfaced, sometimes not. But just asking the question made him feel less crazy and more compassionate toward himself. He wasn't broken. He was layered. One evening, he tried sharing this pond analogy with a close friend who was going through a tough time. The friend said, "But I feel like I am the ripples. When anxiety hits, I can't remember anything deeper exists." He smiled and answered, "Of course. The pond can't see its own depth when the storm is at its peak. That's why we practice remembering on calmer days, so the memory is available when things get rough." He gave his friend a simple exercise. Once a day, when things are okay, close your eyes and imagine that pond. Feel your breath. Notice one thought or feeling passing by, and silently tell yourself, "This is a ripple." Then ask, "And what is watching this ripple?" You don't need a fancy answer. Just feel that you are the one who sees, not just what is seen. The friend later said this became a tiny anchor on bad days. As this way of seeing deepened, he started to notice something beautiful. Moments of peace were not something he created, they were something he uncovered. When the ripples calmed naturally, the pond didn't need to become calm. It already was. In the same way, when his thoughts and emotions softened for a moment, he felt a quietness that seemed older than his problems, older than his personality, almost impersonal and yet deeply intimate. He realized this quiet depth was always there, during laughter, during tears, during overthinking. Like the pond under the wind, it never disappeared. It was just temporarily hidden. And as he became more familiar with it, another question started knocking gently at the door of his heart. If there is always this quiet depth underneath, what happens when he stops constantly disturbing the surface with his own efforts to control everything? That question would lead him to experiment with something very simple and very powerful: the art of doing less and being more. There were mornings when he woke up already tired, even before getting out of bed. The day hadn't started, but his mind had. Thoughts were like heavy clouds, low and gray, blocking any sense of hope. He hadn't even opened the curtains, and yet inside, it already felt like a rainy day. You probably know that feeling too. Nothing terrible happened yet, but the sky inside looks overcast for no clear reason. One day, almost by accident, he woke up earlier than usual. He couldn't sleep, so instead of fighting the insomnia in bed, he decided to step outside. The world was still half asleep. The streets were quiet, the air a little colder, the sky dark but slowly changing. He walked to a nearby hill, not expecting anything special, just needing distance from his pillow and his thoughts. As he stood there, something very simple happened. The sky began to shift. At first, it was almost invisible, just a lighter shade of blue near the horizon. Then hints of purple and pink appeared, like someone was carefully painting color back into the world. He realized he had seen hundreds of sunrises in photos, but very few in real time, with his full attention. This time, he wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking at the sky. While he watched, his mind kept trying to comment. "You're wasting time. You should be sleeping. This won't change anything." But the sky ignored him and kept unfolding its show. The clouds that had seemed so heavy slowly turned golden on their edges. What used to look like bad weather now looked like part of the beauty. He noticed something. The clouds didn't disappear, but his relationship with them changed as the light grew. A sentence he once read in a book came back to him. "Your thoughts are clouds. Your awareness is the sky." At the time, it sounded poetic, but abstract. Now, as he stood there, it felt concrete. His worries, fears, and doubts were like those moving shapes above. They could be thick and dark, but they never altered the nature of the sky itself. The sky remained open, spacious, untouched, even when storms passed through. He thought about the last time he felt completely hopeless. In that moment, it seemed like it would last forever, like the entire sky of his life was permanently gray. But had it? No. The feeling eventually changed, even if slowly. New moments appeared, different emotions came, sometimes even laughter. The cloud had insisted it was permanent, but reality proved it was just passing weather. To make this more practical, he started a tiny habit. Every time his mood dropped suddenly, he would whisper to himself, "Clouds passing." It sounded almost silly, but it helped him create a little space. Instead of saying, "This is who I am now," he began saying, "This is what I'm experiencing now." It's like the difference between "I am the storm" and "I'm standing under the storm." One traps you, the other leaves room for change. He decided to turn sunrises into a kind of meditation. Not every day, but once or twice a week, he'd wake up early, make a simple tea, and sit by a window or outside if possible. The rule was simple. For 15 minutes, no phone, no podcasts, no multitasking, just watching the sky lighten. The mind, of course, tried to hijack the moment with plans and worries, but he would gently return to the colors, the shapes, the subtle shifts. You don't need a special mountain or a perfect view to do this. He sometimes did it from a small apartment window, staring at just a slice of sky between buildings. The point wasn't to have a postcard-worthy horizon. The point was to train his attention to notice how change works. Darkness never fights with light. It simply gives way when light appears. The same thing, he noticed, can happen inside. He also experimented with what he called sunrise questions. Simple reflections he would ask himself as the light grew. Questions like, "What am I assuming will never change?" Or, "Which cloud am I treating as the whole sky right now?" He didn't force answers. He just let the questions hang gently in his awareness, like birds resting on a branch. Sometimes an insight popped up hours later, in the middle of something ordinary. At one point, he realized that many of his inner clouds were actually made of old stories. "I always fail. Nobody really understands me. I'm too late to change." These phrases felt like truth because they had been repeated for years. But when he looked honestly, they were full of holes. There were times he succeeded. People who had shown real care. Moments where he had changed habits. The sky of his life had seen many different weathers, so he tried a new practice. When a heavy mental story appeared, he would quietly ask, "Is this a cloud or the sky?" If it was a cloud, a passing belief, a temporary mood, he treated it like weather, not identity. On especially difficult days, he'd even write it down. Today's inner forecast, 80% chance of doubt with scattered hope in the afternoon. That touch of humor softened the weight it tried to carry. He shared this with someone who struggled with depression. They told him, "But my clouds feel thicker than yours. My sky feels far away." He didn't argue or try to fix it with quick advice. Instead, he said, "You're right. Some cloud layers are heavier, especially when they've been there for years. That's why we don't fight them alone. Therapy, medication, support, those are like weather teams helping clear the sky. Zen is honest. Sometimes we need help beyond thoughts and metaphors. What they both discovered is that even on the darkest days, there are micro sunrises inside. A small act of kindness someone shows you. A moment when the breath slows down on its own. A tiny smile you didn't expect. These are like thin lines of light on the horizon of the mind. If you pay attention to them, even for a few seconds, they remind you, the sky hasn't disappeared. It's just temporarily hidden. He began encouraging people to build their own sunrise rituals, tailored to their reality. For some, it was literally watching the sunrise. For others, it was a warm shower taken slowly, feeling the water like the first light of the day. For another person, it was drinking coffee in silence before checking messages. The ritual itself wasn't magic. It was the intention behind it. For a few minutes, I will remember that I am bigger than my thoughts. Over time, as he watched many dawns, outside and inside, a quiet conviction grew in him. No matter how thick the clouds, the sun had never once failed to rise. It might be hidden, it might be muted, but it was always there, behind everything. That realization didn't erase pain, but it gave pain a frame. And from that frame, another question started to form, gentle but insistent. If the sky and the sun are always there, then who is this someone inside that can notice both clouds and light? That question, who is the one who sees, would become the doorway to a deeper exploration, not just about mood or thoughts anymore, but about identity itself, about the deeper you beneath roles, fears, and stories. And that journey, surprisingly, would begin not with more effort, but with something very simple. Learning how to be quietly alone with yourself without feeling lost. He had a strange relationship with silence. On the one hand, he said he wanted peace. On the other, the moment things got quiet, he would rush to fill the space with something. Music, messages, videos, chores. It wasn't that he hated silence. It was that silence made him bump into himself. And for a long time, he didn't quite know how to be with his own company without feeling a little lost. One evening, after a long day of noise, notifications, conversations, background TV, he suddenly felt exhausted in a different way. Not just physically tired, but mentally saturated, like a browser with too many tabs open. So he did something unusual. He turned everything off. No TV, no music, no scrolling. Just him, his room, and a quiet that felt almost awkward at first, like meeting a stranger. After a few minutes, the first reaction appeared. This is boring. You should be doing something. Right behind it came a second one. If you're alone like this, it's because something is wrong with you. Normal people are busy, connected, surrounded by others. It was interesting to watch how quickly his mind turned simple silence into a personal verdict, as if being alone was proof of being unworthy. He remembered a story he once heard about a young woman sent to a small island with almost nothing, no distractions, no roles, no audience. At first, she felt abandoned, almost punished. But slowly, as the hours passed and her usual identities couldn't function there, something surprising started to appear. Not a new identity, but a quieter presence. The bare fact of simply being aware without needing to perform. Inspired by that, he decided to try a tiny island experiment at home. No, he didn't move to a rock in the sea. He just chose 1 hour once a week, where he would be unavailable to the world and fully available to himself. Phone on airplane mode, no tasks, no productivity. Just walking, sitting, maybe making tea, but without using anything to escape his own company. The first attempts were uncomfortable. Old thoughts surfaced, regrets, unresolved feelings, strange memories from years ago. It was like a drawer he hadn't opened in a long time, a bit messy, a bit dusty. The temptation to grab the phone and run back into distraction was huge. But he stayed, just breathing and noticing, not fixing, not analyzing everything, just letting things arise and pass like waves on a small shore. To make the practice kinder, he gave this hour a name: Island Time. That simple label helped his mind see it not as punishment, but as a retreat. On his inner island, nobody needed him to be funny, productive, attractive, or impressive. He didn't have to answer messages instantly or solve everyone's problems. For 1 hour, his only job was to exist and notice what it's like to simply be. He started adding small rituals to make the island feel welcoming. Sometimes he lit a candle. Sometimes he made his favorite tea. Sometimes he sat near a window, watching the sky, like a lighthouse keeper watching the horizon. Little by little, his nervous system began to associate being alone, not just with emptiness, but with a softness, a kind of gentle homecoming. Of course, not every session felt peaceful. Some island visits were stormy. Old pain would rise, loneliness from childhood, fear of being rejected, moments where he had felt invisible in a room full of people. On those days, he didn't try to be a hero. If things felt too overwhelming, he would shorten the time or even journal a little to give shape to what was swirling inside. The point wasn't to suffer. It was to meet himself honestly. He found that writing helped a lot. During island time, he would sometimes ask himself just one question: what am I actually feeling right now? Without judging, he'd write whatever came. Tired, scared I'm not enough, worried about money, grateful for my friend, confused about the future. There was something healing in seeing these truths on paper, like he was finally listening to a part of himself that had been waiting for years. He also noticed how often he used other people as an escape from his own internal noise. Not in a malicious way, just unconsciously. Always staying busy, always talking, always planning the next hangout. Not because he loved every interaction, but because silence felt dangerous. When he began to build a friendlier relationship with solitude, his connections changed. He no longer needed people to distract him. He could actually enjoy them. One friend asked him, "But what if I feel too lonely when I'm alone? What if it hurts?" He answered honestly, "Sometimes it will hurt. That's not a sign that you're broken. It's a sign there is a part of you that needs attention, compassion, maybe even help from a therapist or a trusted person." The island is not a place to torture yourself. It's a place to finally stop running and say, "Okay, I'm here. What's going on with you?" To make solitude safer, he combined it with kindness. He'd prepare a cozy blanket, choose soft lighting, maybe have a comforting snack. Think of it like inviting a dear guest to your inner island. If you had a friend visiting who was hurting, would you sit them under a cold fluorescent light in a hard chair, interrogating them? Or would you offer warmth, patience, and the permission to just be? He realized he had to learn to treat himself like that friend. Over time, something subtle shifted. The sentence, "I'm alone," slowly began to feel less like a condemnation and more like a simple description. Right now, it's just me here, and that's okay. In certain moments, he even started to enjoy his solitude, reading slowly, drinking coffee in silence, walking without headphones, just listening to birds, cars, wind, and his own footsteps like a simple Zen symphony. He discovered that the more comfortable he became with himself, the less desperate he felt in relationships. He didn't need others to constantly fill a hole inside him, so he could listen better, speak more honestly, and set healthier boundaries. Paradoxically, learning to be alone made him more present when he was with others. His inner island didn't isolate him. It strengthened his capacity to love and be loved without losing himself. One evening, During island time, he asked a deeper question. If all my roles disappeared for a moment, my job, my relationship status, my social media, my titles, what would still remain? The answer did not arrive as a sentence. It arrived as a quiet feeling. Something is here that doesn't depend on any of that. A simple awareness, just watching. That awareness felt strangely familiar, like meeting an old friend he couldn't quite remember. As his friendship with this quiet presence grew, he began to wonder about something new. If there is an inner island where he can simply be, and if that island is always there, even in crowded rooms and stressful days, then how does this inner stability relate to the constant changes of life? Jobs change, relationships shift, health rises and falls. Yet something in him remains. That question, how to stay rooted while everything moves, would lead him to a new image, not of an island this time, but of a river flowing around a stone. He used to think that peace meant freezing life in a perfect moment. The right job, the right person, the right body, the right bank account. Then finally, he could relax. But life, being life, had other plans. People moved away, money fluctuated, health changed, and his heart broke more than once. It felt unfair, as if the universe kept kicking his sandcastle just when it finally looked good. One day, needing air, he walked along a river on the edge of his town. The water moved with that hypnotic rhythm only rivers have. Never the same. Never in a hurry. On the bank, stones of all sizes rested where they had been for years. The contrast was striking. Water always moving. Stones always there. He sat down and watched, without any big spiritual intention, just a tired person resting. After a while, he noticed something simple. The water didn't argue with the stones. It didn't say, "Excuse me, could you move? You're ruining my flow." It just adapted. It curved, swirled, foamed, and slipped around each obstacle. The stones, for their part, didn't try to stop the river. They didn't shout, "Slow down, you're changing everything." They stayed themselves, solid and quiet, letting the current do what currents do. He picked up a smooth rock and held it in his hand. How many years had water flowed over this surface, patiently wearing away its rough edges, not by force, but by endless contact? He suddenly saw his own life in that stone. Every situation, every loss, every success, every misunderstanding, all of it was water, constantly shaping him, not to destroy him, but to polish what was already there. Back home, he realized he had been trying to be only one thing, either all stone or all water. When he felt afraid of change, he tried to become rigid, controlling, clinging, insisting things stay the same. When he felt overwhelmed, he tried to be only water, giving up, letting himself be carried helplessly by circumstances. No wonder he felt exhausted. He was fighting the very nature of reality. So he began a new practice, asking, "Where is my stone today? Where is my river?" The stone was what truly mattered to him, his values, his integrity, the kind of person he wanted to be, no matter what. The river was everything that changed: schedules, opinions, trends, other people's moods, even his own feelings. Differentiating the two brought immediate relief. Not everything deserved full resistance. For example, his value of honesty. That was stone, the exact job where he expressed that honesty. River, his love for a friend. Stone, the frequency of messages and calls, which naturally rose and fell. River, his desire to live with kindness. Stone, whether a stranger liked him or not. River, Seeing this, he could stay rooted in what really mattered, while letting other things move. He started using a simple journal exercise. On one page, he wrote stone at the top. On the opposite page, river. Under stone, he listed things like compassion, truth, respect for my body, spiritual practice, genuine friendships. Under river, he wrote, my job title, people's opinions, my current income, daily energy levels, trends, social media numbers. Whenever stress hit, he'd look and ask, am I panicking over a river as if it were stone? At work, this became very practical. Deadlines shifted, projects got canceled, bosses changed their minds. Before, he would collapse inside, feeling personally attacked by every alteration. Now he whispered to himself, this is river. I can adapt. But when he was asked to do something against his ethics, he felt his inner stone speak up. No, this doesn't move. Having both elements made his no calmer and his yes more flexible. He also noticed how change was slowly shaping him, like water polishing stone. Old impatience was getting smoother as he faced delays. Pride was being worn down each time he made a mistake and had to apologize. Fear of loss softened as he saw that, even after things ended, he was still here, still breathing, still capable of loving again. Life wasn't always gentle, but it was constantly sculpting him. On difficult nights, when anxiety rose, he would close his eyes and imagine lying at the bottom of a river. Not drowning, just being the stone on the riverbed. Thoughts, worries, scenarios flowed above like water, but he stayed resting, heavy in a good way, grounded. Whenever a thought screamed, "This will destroy you," he would answer softly, "I am the stone. You are just water passing." He shared this image with a friend going through a breakup. The friend said, "I feel like I'm being dragged by the current." He replied, "Of course you do. Grief is strong water, but part of you is also the stone that survives every season. You don't have to stop the river to survive it. You just need to remember the part of you that remains, even when everything else changes." The friend didn't stop crying, but something in their posture softened. To honor this balance, he created a small ritual by the river once a month. He'd pick up a stone, hold it, and silently name his non-negotiables. I want to be kind. I want to be honest. I want to learn. I want to stay awake to my life. Then he'd watch the water and name what he was willing to let move. Plans, opinions, timelines, expectations. It was his way of telling the universe, I'm willing to be shaped, but not erased. Little by little, he noticed that the same changes that once terrified him were actually the things that had grown him the most. Moves to new places, ends of relationships, lost jobs, health scares. None of them were pleasant, but each one had smoothed a part of him that was previously sharp, fearful, or closed. Like the river, life had been slowly revealing a clearer version of who he could be. And yet, there was still a mystery whispering beneath all this. If he was both stone and river, both a stable awareness and a changing story, what was this deeper something that held them together? What was this wide space in which both the shifting currents and the quiet rock appeared? That question, soft but persistent, would eventually lead him higher, toward another image, not of rivers and stones now, but of mountain peaks and the valleys that stretch below. There were phases in his life where he wanted to run away from everything: bills, messages, responsibilities, messy relationships. It all felt like too much. He dreamed of disappearing to a cabin in the mountains, living on tea and silence, far from traffic and notifications. Maybe then, he thought, he'd finally find peace. But a hidden fear whispered, if I go that far away, will I still know how to live when I come back? One afternoon, he actually did go to the mountains, not forever, just for a weekend retreat. The climb was tiring, but when he reached the viewpoint, the whole valley stretched below like a map. Houses were tiny, roads thin like threads. Things that felt huge when he was down there, arguments, deadlines, errands, suddenly looked small from this height. Not meaningless, but part of a bigger picture. Sitting there, he noticed his breathing slowing. The mind, which usually zoomed in on every problem like a camera stuck in macro mode, began to zoom out. He could see patterns, how certain fears repeated, how worries came in cycles, how life had seasons. From up there, his story seemed less like a crisis and more like a chapter inside a much larger book. But he didn't stay forever. Evening came, temperature dropped, and hunger reminded him he was still very human. He walked back down the path, step by step, returning to the noisy, imperfect valley where people laughed, argued, burned dinner, and worried about money. As he descended, he felt a strange realization. Both places were real. The mountain's peace and the valley's chaos were two sides of the same world. Back in daily life, he began to notice a pattern in spiritual people around him and in himself. Some loved mountain moments, retreats, deep meditations, long philosophical talks about emptiness and oneness. From that high view, problems seemed almost illusory. Others lived only in the valley, working, caring for family, fighting fires, never lifting their eyes to see the larger sky. Both groups felt incomplete. He realized he had spent years jumping between extremes. After burnout, he'd go full mountain, hyper-spiritual, withdrawing, reading deep books, avoiding messy conversations. Then, feeling guilty or restless, he'd swing back to full valley, overworking, overcommitting, saying yes to everyone, losing touch with himself. It was like trying to breathe only in or only out. No wonder he was dizzy, so he tried a new approach. Instead of choosing one side, he would practice moving consciously between both. In the morning, he'd give himself some mountain time, maybe 10 minutes of meditation, or simply looking at the sky with his coffee, remembering the bigger view. I am alive on a spinning planet with a limited number of days. Do I really want to spend this one only panicking? Then, after touching that perspective, he'd go into his valley tasks with more presence, answering emails, changing diapers, replying to messages, cooking, working. The difference was subtle but powerful. Instead of seeing these things as interruptions to his spiritual life, he started seeing them as part of the path. The dishes were not the enemy of enlightenment. They were the training ground for patience. He also built mini mountains into his schedule. Once a week, he'd take a longer walk alone, no headphones, just noticing his thoughts like clouds. Once a month, he'd have a half-day retreat at home. Less talking, more silence, journaling, breathing. Nothing complicated or expensive. Just intentional distance to see life from a higher angle, like climbing a little hill instead of a huge peak. The effect showed up especially in moments of crisis. When something went wrong, a rejection, a sudden bill, a harsh message, his old habit was to react as if this moment was the whole universe. Now, he'd pause and ask, mountain or valley? From the valley. Yes, it hurt. From the mountain, it was one event in a long journey. Holding both perspectives at once made the pain more bearable and his response wiser. He noticed this helped in relationships too. When someone close to him was suffering, the mountain voice in his head sometimes wanted to say, "Everything is temporary. Nothing has a separate self. It's all emptiness." True, maybe, but not very kind at that moment. So he learned a better rhythm. First, valley. Listen. Comfort. Be human. Later, mountain. Gently share perspective, if the person was ready. At work, this balance became surprisingly practical. Big picture thinking, mountain, helped him not drown in daily stress. Detailed focus, valley, helped him actually get things done. When a project fell apart, he could say, "From the mountain, this is just one attempt in a whole career. From the valley, I still need to send that email and fix what I can." Wisdom became less about choosing one view and more about knowing when to use each. He realized that spirituality without valley life easily becomes fantasy. It's easy to feel enlightened when nobody cuts you off in traffic, nobody talks back, and no one depends on you. In the same way, valley life without any mountain view becomes suffocating. You forget why you're doing things, you lose the sense of meaning, and every small problem feels like the end of the world. So he began asking himself a simple question a few times a day. Am I too high or too low right now? If he was lost in abstract ideas, disconnected from his body and emotions, it was time to come down, cook, clean, talk to a friend, feel his feet on the floor. If he was buried in drama and stress, it was time to go up, breathe, step outside, look at the sky. Remember, he was more than this moment. Slowly, he discovered that the real practice wasn't to escape to the mountain or to drown in the valley, but to be like a path between them, a human bridge, someone who could sit in silence and then change a diaper without complaining that life interrupted his peace. Someone who could meditate deeply and also laugh at silly jokes with friends. Someone who could see patterns and hold hands during pain. Over time, this gave him a new kind of confidence. Not the arrogant confidence of, "I know everything," but the quiet trust of, "Wherever I am, high or low, I can find my way." Mountain and valley were no longer enemies. They were two necessary views for one life. And yet, inside him, another tension still lived. The battle between the parts of himself he loved and the parts he secretly wanted to hide. Because even with a wiser perspective, he still judged himself harshly, proud of his sun qualities and ashamed of his shadow side. The next step in his journey would not be about geography at all, but about inner weather, learning to accept that, just like the sky holds both day and night, his own heart could hold both light and shadow without tearing itself apart. For most of his life, he divided himself into two boxes. In one box, he put everything he was proud of: his kindness, his generosity, his creativity, his humor. That was his sun. In the other box, he hid everything he despised: jealousy, resentment, laziness, bitterness, moments of pettiness. That was his shadow, the side he prayed no one would ever truly see. Because of that split, he was always at war inside. When he was patient, he felt worthy. When he snapped, he felt like a fraud. When he helped someone, he imagined a golden light around his head. When he judged someone silently, he imagined that same light shattering. It was exhausting to live as if every thought proved whether he was a good person or a bad person. One evening, just before bed, he went for a short walk. The sky was in that in-between moment when the sun hadn't fully left and the moon had already arrived, orange and purple in the west, cool blue in the east, and a pale moon quietly rising above houses and trees. For a second, it struck him. Day and night were sharing the same sky, not fighting for dominance. He stopped and stared. The last warmth of the sun painted the horizon, while the moon's soft light began to wash over everything. Neither was wrong. Neither apologized for being different. The world didn't demand that it be only day or only night. In that quiet moment, he wondered, what if my heart is like this sky, big enough to hold both my sun and my moon without exploding? He remembered how hard he tried to always be positive. When sadness appeared, he'd quickly tell himself, "You're blessed, stop complaining." When envy arose, he'd crush it under. "You should be happy for others." It sounded noble, but inside it felt like pushing parts of himself into a basement and locking the door. Those parts didn't disappear. They just started banging louder. So he tried a small experiment. Instead of labeling qualities as allowed or forbidden, he treated them like weather. When jealousy appeared, he didn't scream, "You're a monster." He simply said, "Ah, jealousy is here. What is it trying to show you?" Often, the answer was simple. You want that kind of recognition too. You're afraid you'll never have it. Not evil, just human. He began to notice that many ugly feelings were twisted signals of something deeper. Anger sometimes pointed to a boundary crossed. Envy pointed to a desire ignored. Bitterness pointed to a hurt never acknowledged. Like the moon, these feelings lived in the darker part of his sky, but they weren't enemies. They were messengers that had never been heard. One day, a friend shared good news, a promotion, more money, more status. He smiled and congratulated them, but inside, a tight knot of jealousy formed. For years, he would have pretended it wasn't there, then judged himself quietly later. This time, he went home, sat on his bed, and honestly admitted, "Part of me is jealous, part of me is happy for them. Both true, both allowed to exist." In that honest admission, something softened. The jealousy lost some of its poison once it was seen without shame. He could ask, gently, "What do you really want?" The answer wasn't their job, but a life where your talents are seen and valued. That was a healthy desire, so instead of using jealousy to attack himself, he used it as information to adjust his own path a little. He also started to see how much energy people spend pretending. The always cheerful coworker who never sets boundaries then explodes. The spiritual friend who speaks of love and light but secretly avoids conflict and hard conversations. The relative who seems strong but never cries and then numbs out in private. Everyone trying to be only sun, terrified of their moon. So he gave himself a new inner sentence. You are the sky, not the weather. The sky doesn't panic when clouds appear. It doesn't cling when the sun shines. It doesn't hate the night or worship the day. It holds all of it. In the same way, he practiced noticing thoughts and feelings without immediately turning them into a verdict. I have anger felt very different from I am anger. To make this practical, he used a simple sun and moon check-in in his journal. On one side of the page, he wrote, "Today, my sun was," and listed moments he was kind, brave, honest, gentle. On the other side, "Today, my moon was," and listed moments he was impatient, jealous, avoidant, scared. Then, instead of punishing himself, he asked one question. What is each side trying to protect or teach? Sometimes his moon showed him where he still felt unworthy. Sometimes his son reminded him how far he'd already come. Together, they formed a more complete picture of who he was. Not a cardboard saint, not a hopeless sinner, but a complex human learning to walk. Seeing both sides on paper made him less afraid of himself. Nothing inside him was unspeakable anymore. He also began talking differently to people he loved. When someone confessed, "I feel so petty and jealous," instead of replying, "Don't be like that," he would say, "Of course you feel that. You're human. Let's look at what it's pointing to." It was as if he was telling them, "Your moon is allowed here too." That kind of acceptance made people relax and be more honest. Little by little, the internal war quieted, not because his negative traits disappeared overnight, but because he stopped treating them as enemies that had to die. They were parts of him that needed education, guidance, and sometimes firm boundaries, but not hatred. Just as the moon doesn't apologize for shining differently than the sun, he stopped apologizing for being complex. One night, lying in bed between wakefulness and sleep, he looked out the window and saw the full moon hanging in the sky. It lit up the landscape in a way the sun never did. Softer, stranger, revealing different shapes, different shadows. He realized that some of his deepest insights had come during dark phases of his life. Heartbreaks, losses, mistakes. His moon had always been quietly teaching him. And yet, there was still something he was not fully facing. Some feelings in him weren't just shadows. They felt frozen, places where he'd shut down instead of feeling. Memories he skipped over, emotions he numbed with food, screens, or overwork. These weren't just dark. They were hard, cold, untouched, like ice that never melts. To truly make peace with himself, he would have to go there too, to the frozen lake inside, and begin the slow, patient thaw. There was a time when he didn't feel sad or angry anymore, and thought that was a win. No more crying, no more shouting, no more big emotions exploding everywhere. People even said, "You're so strong, nothing shakes you." Inside, though, it didn't feel like strength. It felt empty, like there was a huge lake inside him, but the surface had turned to ice. He could talk about his past like he was reading someone else's story. Breakups, disappointments, family wounds. He described them calmly, almost coldly. No tremor in his voice, no tears in his eyes. Therapists call this detachment. But to him, it felt like watching his own life through a window. He wasn't drowning anymore. True. But he also couldn't swim. Everything was frozen. What most people didn't see was how much effort it took to keep that ice solid. He stayed busy, always with something to do. Phone in hand, work open, tasks, dramas, scrolling until his eyes burned. Silence scared him, because silence meant things might start melting. And if they melted, he was afraid he'd break, or never stop crying, or lose control in a way he couldn't fix. One winter, walking near an actual frozen lake, he suddenly recognized himself in it. On the surface, the ice looked calm, almost beautiful, white, still, pure. But he knew from science class and documentaries that beneath that ice, the water was still there, heavy and cold and very alive. The lake wasn't gone. It was simply locked under a hard surface, waiting for warmer days. That's when it hit him. Numbness isn't the absence of emotion. It's emotion held in a rigid form, the grief he never allowed, the fear he joked about, the anger he swallowed, none of it. had disappeared. It had just frozen, and that ice needed constant energy to maintain. Distractions, avoidance. "I'm fine, really," said over and over, until even he almost believed it. He understood why he had done it. At some point, feeling became too much. Maybe it was a loss that shook the ground under his feet. Maybe growing up in a house where emotions were unsafe or mocked. Maybe one heartbreak too many. Freezing was intelligent at the time. It was how he survived. The problem wasn't that he froze once. The problem was staying frozen long after the danger had passed. Standing by that winter lake, he did something small but important. He placed his hand on the ice and simply acknowledged, "There is water under here." Inside, he whispered something similar. "There are feelings under here I haven't let myself feel." He didn't try to force anything. No big healing moment. Just honest recognition that he was not empty. He was covered. Instead of attacking the ice with a hammer, he decided to trust a different method: warmth. When he was ready, he gave himself permission to feel just 5% more than usual. Not 100%, just a tiny bit. If a memory hurt, instead of changing the subject instantly, he allowed 3 extra seconds of contact. If tears came to his eyes, he tried not to swallow them back immediately. He also noticed which things acted like a gentle spring sun for him. Certain songs brought emotions closer to the surface. Certain movies, certain prayers, certain quiet moments in the shower with no phone. Rather than running from these, he started using them intentionally. Not every day. Just sometimes, when he felt strong enough, he'd gently invite the ice to soften a little. One practical tool that helped was writing letters he never intended to send, to his younger self, to someone who hurt him, to someone he disappointed. He let the truth spill out in messy, honest sentences. Not spiritual, not pretty, sometimes not fair, just raw. Afterward, he didn't rewrite them. He didn't judge them. He folded the paper, took a breath, and said softly, "This is part of me, too." The fear that he'd break forever if he started feeling turned out to be untrue. Yes, some days were intense. He had evenings where a wave of sadness came, and he had to lie down and let it pass like a storm. But just like real storms, they eventually moved on. The more he allowed these emotional rains, the less pressure there was behind the dam. The lake inside him began to move again. He realized that numbness had also numbed joy. You can't freeze only one side of the lake. When he kept pain at a distance, he also dulled excitement, tenderness, wonder. As the ice slowly melted, he noticed that small things started touching him again. The way light hit the wall, a child laughing in a supermarket, a simple "thank you" from a stranger. Life had more texture. For someone watching from outside, nothing dramatic changed. He still went to work, replied to messages, paid bills, but internally, everything was different. Instead of living on the hard, sleek ice, he now had access to the water underneath. Some days it was calm, some days it was choppy, but at least he was touching something real. He was no longer just a character in his own story, he was present. Of course, old habits returned sometimes. He'd catch himself grabbing his phone at the first sign of discomfort, or laughing off something that hurt. Instead of criticizing himself, "You're back to freezing," he tried a new response. "Of course you're scared. You froze for years. Thawing takes time." That kindness toward his own defense mechanisms became, ironically, the warmest flame. What surprised him most was that, as he thawed, he became more compassionate toward others. He could see behind the sarcasm of a coworker, the I don't care attitude of a teenager, the constant joking of a friend. He recognized the ice. Instead of judging them as shallow or insensitive, he quietly thought, "You're protecting something tender too, aren't you?" And yet, thawing the frozen lake raised another question. Once feelings and memories start flowing, where do they go? How do you live your daily life? Work, relationships, responsibilities. When deeper layers of yourself are moving again, he began to sense that his inner work wasn't just about feeling, but about cultivating a place of stability that could hold all that movement, like a riverbed guiding water instead of being washed away. There was a phase in his life when he tried to be the rock, unshakable, always in control, the one everyone could lean on. No breakdowns, no doubts, no changes of mind. On the outside, it looked admirable. People said, "You're so strong, so stable." Inside, though, he felt something strange. The more rigid he became, the more fragile he felt. Then life did what life always does. It changed, a relationship ended, a job shifted, a plan collapsed. He tried to resist, to lock everything in place. No, it can't be like this. This is not how it was supposed to go. That resistance was exhausting, like trying to push back the tide with his bare hands. The more he fought, the more tired and bitter he became. One afternoon, after a particularly tough week, he walked by a river near his home. The water moved around rocks of all sizes, big boulders, tiny pebbles, all of them sitting there while the current flowed. The stones weren't chasing the water. The water wasn't trying to drag the stones away. They simply existed together, solid and fluid, side by side. He sat on the bank and watched. The longer he looked, the more he saw. Some stones barely disturbed the flow. Others created whirlpools, splashes, little waves. But still, the water kept moving. No drama, no complaints, just flow. He realized he'd been trying to be stone against the water of life, trying to stop change instead of learning how to exist gracefully within it. In that moment, a new idea appeared. What if I am both river and stone? Part of him is the awareness that doesn't change so quickly. His values, his deeper sense of self. That's the stone. Another part is his emotions, circumstances, moods, stories, always moving, always shifting. That's the river. His suffering came from trying to be only one, when life was clearly asking him to be both. He began to test this idea in small ways. When something changed at work, a new boss, a new system, instead of clinging to, "But it's always been like this," he asked, "What is the water doing now? How can I adapt?" At the same time, he checked in with his inner stone. What values stay the same here? Respect, honesty, effort. The mix of flexibility and stability felt strangely balanced. Think about a moment when life forced you to adapt, moving to another city, changing jobs, becoming a parent, losing someone, or even recovering from an injury. Part of you probably wanted everything to stay exactly as it was. Another part had no choice but to move with the new reality. The pain often comes from pretending you have only one of these parts, when really both are present. He also noticed something the river did to the stones. It polished them. The rocks closest to the current were smoother, their sharp edges softened by years and years of water passing by. That was a comforting thought. Maybe the very experiences he complained about, heartbreaks, delays, frustrations, were shaping him in ways nothing else could. He remembered times when life had worn him down. Back then, he saw it only as loss, lost innocence, lost naive optimism, lost illusions. But sitting by the river, he realized that some of those losses were actually rough edges being sanded away. He'd become less arrogant, more compassionate, less judgmental, more observant. The water hadn't destroyed him. It had carved him. To make this practical, he started asking a new question whenever something didn't go his way. What edge in me might this be polishing? For example, a delayed project could polish impatience. A disagreement could polish pride, teaching him to really listen. A failure could polish perfectionism. This didn't magically make difficulty easy, but it gave it meaning. And meaning changes everything. He also began to see that fighting every change didn't make him stronger, it just made him tired. Strong doesn't mean nothing ever moves. Strong can mean I have roots, but I bend with the wind. Think of bamboo, deeply rooted, yet flexible. In a storm, rigid trees snap. Bamboo survives. He asked himself, where can I be more bamboo and less concrete? Of course, there were times he went too far in the other direction and became only water. He flowed so much with others' needs and demands that he lost himself, saying yes when he meant no, adapting so much that he disappeared. Those moments reminded him, you need your inner stone too, your boundaries, your truth, your this is who I am. So he created a little inner ritual. When facing a tough situation, he'd pause and ask two simple questions. What would the stone in me say? And what would the river in me do? The stone spoke about principles, limits, dignity. The river spoke about timing, adaptation, creativity. Letting both voices be heard often revealed a wiser path than listening to just one. Over time, he saw the same pattern in people around him. Some were all stone. I've always been this way. I don't change for anyone. They were safe, but lonely, hard to connect with, easily cracked when life really hit. Others were all water, changing opinions every week, saying whatever others wanted to hear, constantly exhausted and ungrounded. Neither extreme felt peaceful. Zen teachers say that true wisdom is not all or nothing, but both in balance, river and stone, stability and flow, roots and movement. Watching that river day after day, he began to trust that he didn't need to choose once and for all who he was. He only needed to notice in each situation whether it was time to stand firm or to move with the current, or a bit of both. Eventually, he realized something even deeper. Behind both river and stone, there was something else watching. A quiet awareness, like the sky, that simply saw the movement of the water and the stillness of the rocks without being either one. That awareness gave him space inside. But understanding this raised a new question. How could he hold the vast sky-like view of life and still show up fully in the very human, messy valley of daily responsibilities and relationships? He used to think spiritual growth would feel like a movie scene. One big moment, lightning in the sky, tears in the eyes, music in the background, and suddenly, now I am transformed. But real life wasn't like that. Most days felt ordinary. Some days felt messy. And he kept asking himself, if I'm doing all this inner work, why don't I feel dramatically different? One day, an old mentor invited him to visit a simple vegetable garden behind a tiny monastery. Nothing fancy. Rows of tomatoes, beans climbing on strings, herbs, flowers, patches of soil that looked almost empty. The mentor said, people think practice is fireworks, but it's much more like this. At first, he didn't understand. It was just dirt and plants. They knelt by a patch where tiny green shoots were emerging. These, the mentor said, were invisible for weeks. Under the soil, they were changing, opening, reaching down roots. If you had judged this garden by what you saw above ground, you would have said, "Nothing is happening." But that would have been wrong. That sentence cut straight through him. He realized he had been judging his inner life the same way, sitting in meditation for a week and thinking, "Nothing's happening," trying to be kinder for a few days and thinking, "I'm still the same. What's the point?" He was measuring growth only by obvious, dramatic results, not by the quiet work happening beneath the surface of his daily efforts. The mentor started pulling small weeds, making sure to get the roots. "These little guys," he said, smiling, "are like old habits. If you just rip off the top, they come back stronger. You have to go a bit deeper. Be patient. Take the root." He thought of his own patterns: jealousy, resentment, constant comparison. He'd been trying to stop them overnight, instead of patiently understanding where they grew from. To make it concrete, he tried something new. Every time a painful pattern showed up, like overthinking before sleep, or replaying old conversations, instead of yelling at himself internally, he imagined kneeling in his own inner garden. "Okay, here's a weed," he'd say. "Where are your roots? Fear, shame, old stories?" That gentle curiosity was already different from the usual harsh self-criticism. They moved to a bed full of young seedlings, fragile but alive. "These," the mentor said, "are new habits, new ways of thinking and living. They need care, not pressure, care. If you scream at a seed, it doesn't grow faster." He laughed softly at that image, because that's exactly what he'd been doing, screaming at his own process, demanding instant results. So he began to treat small good choices as seedlings. A 5-minute meditation, one honest conversation, putting the phone down at night and breathing instead of scrolling, saying no once where he always said yes. Tiny actions, easy to ignore. But in his new view, each one was a little green shoot that needed protection from the storms of self-doubt. He also noticed how tempted he was to compare gardens, looking at other people and thinking, "Their life is so much more advanced. Look how peaceful, how successful, how disciplined they are." The mentor pointed to different plants and said, "You can't compare the tomato to the rose and say one is behind. They have different timing, different needs. It's the same with people." That insight helped him when he saw someone further along in some area. Money, relationships, spirituality. Instead of thinking, "I'm failing," he tried a different question. What season am I in? Maybe he was in spring, just starting. Maybe in summer, actively growing. Maybe in winter, where everything looks dead, but roots are secretly gathering strength. Each season had its own wisdom. Sometimes, the mentor had to prune a branch, cut back something that looked alive. "If I leave this," he explained, "it will steal energy from what really needs to grow." That felt uncomfortably familiar. There were habits and even relationships in his life that weren't evil, just draining. Social media that left him empty. Conversations that always went in circles. Routines that ate his time but fed nothing real. Slowly, he began pruning. Less time with people who constantly dragged him into gossip. Less time chasing quick dopamine hits online. A little more time resting, reading something that nourished him, or just sitting quietly. It hurt at first. Letting go always stings. But after a while, he felt lighter, like his inner garden could finally breathe. The mentor also reminded him that gardens have boring days. Some mornings, he said, I just water and walk away. Nothing exciting happens. But if I skip those simple days, the whole garden suffers. That was a revelation. Maybe the spiritually boring days, short meditations, small acts of kindness, basic self-care, were exactly the days that kept his inner life alive. So he made a quiet agreement with himself. I'll show up like a gardener, even when it's not dramatic, even when I feel nothing special. 1 page of journaling, 2 minutes of conscious breathing before sleep, saying thank you sincerely once a day. These were his new tools, like watering, weeding, pruning, without expecting fireworks each time. Over months, he noticed subtle changes. He still got irritated, but sometimes he recognized it faster. He still felt anxious, but sometimes he remembered to breathe and let the wave pass instead of drowning in it. These were not big cinematic miracles. They were small, consistent shifts, like a plant growing a few millimeters at a time, invisible day to day, obvious over a season. Every now and then, something beautiful happened. Someone would say, "You seem calmer lately," or "You listen differently now." Those comments were like flowers opening, proof that the daily work was real. Not because he was perfect, but because he was tending his inner garden with patience instead of desperation. And yet, even with this sense of slow growth, another question began to rise in him. What about all the parts he had not tended? The frozen corners of his heart he had locked away for years. The griefs he had never allowed himself to feel. The memories he had covered with ice. A garden can grow. But what happens to the patches that were never touched at all? The ones that feel less like soil and more like a frozen lake. There was a period in his life when he didn't feel much of anything. On the outside, he laughed at the right moments, said, "I'm fine," when people asked, did what needed to be done. But inside, it felt like winter. Not the cozy kind with blankets and hot tea, the hard kind. Cold, silent, frozen. He didn't even cry. It was like his heart had turned into a quiet block of ice. At first, he thought this was strength. "Look how nothing breaks me," he told himself. He could go through losses, arguments, disappointments, and keep functioning. No tears, no drama. People even admired him. "You're so strong," they'd say. But late at night, when the house was quiet, that strength felt like emptiness, like standing in front of a frozen lake, knowing there was water beneath, but unable to reach it. One day, he heard a story about a monk who had lived for years in a mountain hermitage, proud of his calm. No big emotions, no breakdowns, just discipline and control. Then one winter, the lake near the hermitage froze completely, and the monk realized, "This is my heart." The calm he was so proud of was not peace, it was ice. That story hit him in a tender place. He began to notice how he handled pain. When someone hurt him, he would say, "Whatever, I don't care," and change the subject. When memories rose, he'd distract himself with food, social media, or work. He didn't explode, didn't scream, didn't cry. He just froze. The lake stayed hard, season after season. Slowly, he started to understand why. There had been moments in his life when feeling everything would have broken him. As a child, maybe he had no one safe to talk to. As a teenager, maybe he learned that crying meant being mocked. As an adult, maybe the responsibilities were so heavy that collapsing wasn't an option. Freezing had been his nervous system's way of saying, "Let me protect you." Seeing that changed the tone of his inner voice. Instead of hating his numbness, he began to see it as a bodyguard that had been on duty for too long. The ice wasn't his enemy. It was an old survival strategy. He didn't need to smash it with a hammer. He needed to thank it and gently show it that times had changed, that maybe now feeling was safer than before. He began with very small experiments. When a difficult memory came up, instead of running away, he'd place a hand on his chest and say silently, "I'm here, just for 10 seconds. I'll stay with this." 10 seconds is not a lot, but for someone who always escapes inside, it's a brave first step. It was like kneeling on the frozen lake and just feeling the cold instead of pretending it wasn't there. Sometimes he'd notice a physical ache, a tight throat, a heavy stomach, a knot between his ribs. Before, he'd ignore it. Now, he'd sit quietly for a few breaths and ask, if this sensation could speak, what would it say? Sometimes the answer was clear. "I'm sad." Sometimes it was just a wordless heaviness. That was okay. You don't have to understand the whole lake to know there's water under the ice. There were days when nothing seemed to thaw. He'd sit in meditation or lie in bed trying to feel something and only meet a kind of gray fog. In those moments, the old voice returned, "See, you're broken. Other people cry. You're just frozen forever." But then he remembered the mountain story. Even the coldest lake melts when seasons change. No winter is permanent. So he shifted his focus from melting everything now to bringing warmth regularly. A warm bath taken with awareness. A walk under the sun, feeling light on his skin. Listening to a song that moved him years ago. Writing a letter he'd never send, just to say what had once been unsayable. Each of these small acts was like breathing warm air onto the ice, patiently, day after day. At times, the thaw showed up in surprising ways. He'd watch a movie and suddenly find tears in his eyes over a scene that wasn't even that dramatic. Or someone would tell a simple story about their childhood, and he'd feel a lump in his throat. A part of him wanted to shut it down. "Don't start now." But another part whispered, "This is the lake cracking. Let it." There were also moments when old grief rushed up so fast it scared him. A memory of someone who had died. A breakup from years ago. Words he wished he could take back. It felt like the ice had suddenly broken and all the water was flooding at once. When that happened, he reminded himself to go slow. Drink water. Breathe into the belly. Ground his feet on the floor. He could step in and out of the feeling, like walking back and forth from shore to lake instead of drowning. One simple practice helped him a lot. He'd imagine sitting on the shore of his own frozen lake at sunrise. At first, everything was hard and white. Then, as the sun rose, tiny patches of water appeared near the edges. Not huge, not dramatic, just little, honest circles of liquid. Those patches were the moments he allowed himself to feel a bit, cry a bit, talk a bit. The lake was still mostly frozen, but the process had begun. With time, he discovered something softer on the other side of the ice. Underneath the frozen anger and numbness, there was always something more vulnerable. Sadness, love, longing. Often, it wasn't rage that needed expression. It was grief that had been waiting in the dark, like water under ice, whispering, "Please see me. Please let me exist." He learned that healing wasn't about getting rid of the lake. It was about changing its season, letting it be a place of reflection again. Not just numbness, a space where feelings could move like water, waves gently touching the shore, instead of being locked in place. He could still function, still live his life, but now there was movement inside instead of just cold stillness. And yet, another subtle challenge appeared. As his feelings thawed, he noticed he could sometimes get overwhelmed, drawn into storms of emotion. The ice was gone, but now the waves were strong. He realized he would need another kind of wisdom, not freezing, not drowning, but learning how to stay anchored even when the inner weather was wild. Like someone learning to stand steadily on a small boat, no matter how the water moves beneath their feet. There was a period in his life when he didn't feel much of anything. On the outside, he laughed at the right moments, said, "I'm fine," when people asked, did what needed to be done. But inside, it felt like winter. Not the cozy kind with blankets and hot tea, the hard kind, cold, silent, frozen. He didn't even cry. It was like his heart had turned into a quiet block of ice. At first, he thought this was strength. "Look how nothing breaks me," he told himself. He could go through losses, arguments, disappointments, and keep functioning. No tears, no drama. People even admired him. "You're so strong," they'd say. But late at night, when the house was quiet, that strength felt like emptiness. Like standing in front of a frozen lake, knowing there was water beneath, but unable to reach it. One day, he heard a story about a monk who had lived for years in a mountain hermitage, proud of his calm. No big emotions, no breakdowns, just discipline and control. Then one winter, the lake near the hermitage froze completely, and the monk realized, "This is my heart." The calm he was so proud of was not peace, it was ice. That story hit him in a tender place. He began to notice how he handled pain. When someone hurt him, he would say, "Whatever, I don't care," and change the subject. When memories rose, he'd distract himself with food, social media, or work. He didn't explode, didn't scream, didn't cry. He just froze. The lake stayed hard, season after season. Slowly, he started to understand why. There had been moments in his life when feeling everything would have broken him. As a child, maybe he had no one safe to talk to. As a teenager, maybe he learned that crying meant being mocked. As an adult, maybe the responsibilities were so heavy that collapsing wasn't an option. Freezing had been his nervous system's way of saying, "Let me protect you." Seeing that changed the tone of his inner voice. Instead of hating his numbness, he began to see it as a bodyguard that had been on duty for too long. The ice wasn't his enemy. It was an old survival strategy. He didn't need to smash it with a hammer. He needed to thank it and gently show it that times had changed, that maybe now feeling was safer than before. He began with very small experiments. When a difficult memory came up, instead of running away, he'd place a hand on his chest and say silently, "I'm here, just for 10 seconds. I'll stay with this." 10 seconds is not a lot, but for someone who always escapes inside, it's a brave first step. It was like kneeling on the frozen lake and just feeling the cold instead of pretending it wasn't there. Sometimes he'd notice a physical ache, a tight throat, a heavy stomach, a knot between his ribs. Before, he'd ignore it. Now, he'd sit quietly for a few breaths and ask, if this sensation could speak, what would it say? Sometimes the answer was clear, "I'm sad." Sometimes it was just a wordless heaviness. That was okay. You don't have to understand the whole lake to know there's water under the ice. There were days when nothing seemed to thaw. He'd sit in meditation or lie in bed trying to feel something, and only meet a kind of gray fog. In those moments, the old voice returned. See? You're broken. Other people cry. You're just frozen forever. But then he remembered the mountain story. Even the coldest lake melts when seasons change. No winter is permanent. So he shifted his focus from melting everything now to bringing warmth regularly. A warm bath taken with awareness. A walk under the sun, feeling light on his skin. Listening to a song that moved him years ago. Writing a letter he'd never send, just to say what had once been unsayable. Each of these small acts was like breathing warm air onto the ice, patiently, day after day. At times, the thaw showed up in surprising ways. He'd watch a movie and suddenly find tears in his eyes over a scene that wasn't even that dramatic. Or someone would tell a simple story about their childhood, and he'd feel a lump in his throat. A part of him wanted to shut it down. Don't start now. But another part whispered, this is the lake cracking. Let it. There were also moments when old grief rushed up so fast it scared him. A memory of someone who had died, a breakup from years ago, words he wished he could take back. It felt like the ice had suddenly broken and all the water was flooding at once. When that happened, he reminded himself to go slow. Drink water, breathe into the belly, ground his feet on the floor. He could step in and out of the feeling, like walking back and forth from shore to lake, instead of drowning. One simple practice helped him a lot. He'd imagine sitting on the shore of his own frozen lake at sunrise. At first, everything was hard and white. Then, as the sun rose, tiny patches of water appeared near the edges. Not huge, not dramatic, just little, honest circles of liquid. Those patches were the moments he allowed himself to feel a bit, cry a bit, talk a bit. The lake was still mostly frozen, but the process had begun. With time, he discovered something softer on the other side of the ice. Underneath the frozen anger and numbness, there was always something more vulnerable. Sadness, love, longing. Often, it wasn't rage that needed expression. It was grief that had been waiting in the dark, like water under ice, whispering, "Please see me. Please let me exist." He learned that healing wasn't about getting rid of the lake. It was about changing its season, letting it be a place of reflection again, not just numbness, a space where feelings could move like water, waves gently touching the shore, instead of being locked in place. He could still function, still live his life, but now there was movement inside instead of just cold stillness. And yet, another subtle challenge appeared. As his feelings thawed, he noticed he could sometimes get overwhelmed, drawn into storms of emotion. The ice was gone, but now the waves were strong. He realized he would need another kind of wisdom, not freezing, not drowning, but learning how to stay anchored even when the inner weather was wild. Like someone learning to stand steadily on a small boat, no matter how the water moves beneath their feet. He began to notice something curious about his own energy. Some weeks he felt wide open and alive, wanting to meditate, journal, talk, learn, change his life. Other weeks he felt quieter, heavier, more inward. Before, he called those bad weeks or unproductive days. Now, with all the images of river, stone, and lake inside him, he started to wonder, what if this isn't failure? What if it's a rhythm? One night he walked outside and looked up. The moon was only a thin crescent, like a shy smile in the sky. A few weeks earlier, it had been huge and bright, lighting up the whole neighborhood. It struck him. The moon doesn't stay the same. It grows, shines fully, then shrinks and disappears into darkness, only to return again. No rush, no guilt, just a perfect circle of change. He realized he had been asking himself to be a permanent full moon, always bright, always productive, always emotionally available, always ready for deep practice. No rest, no dark nights, no quiet phases allowed. When his energy naturally waned, he attacked himself. You're lazy. You're slipping. You're losing everything you gained. The inner critic didn't understand the sky, so he tried a gentle experiment. For 1 month, he decided to watch both the moon and his own mood. On the days the moon grew, he usually felt more outward, wanting to talk, create, reorganize his room, plan projects. On the days it shrank, he often wanted to read quietly, sleep more, listen instead of speak. It wasn't perfect, but there was a pattern, like two waves dancing together. Instead of forcing himself to meditate the same way every single day, he adjusted the form, not the commitment. On full moon days inside, he'd do deeper, longer sessions, sit upright, light a candle, journal afterward. On new moon days, he'd choose softer practices, lying down meditation, a few mindful breaths in bed, a slow walk paying attention to sound and smell. Same path, different shoes. He noticed that when he respected his slower phases, they actually passed more quickly and kindly. Before, when he fought them, they seemed to drag on forever, like a stubborn, cloudy sky. When he said, "Okay, this week is quieter. I'll rest a bit more, go slower, take the pressure off," his energy started to rebuild almost by itself. Just like nature knows how to move from winter to spring. In work, he started playing with this too. On high energy days, he'd tackle complex tasks, deep focus, hard conversations. On low energy days, he'd do simpler things, organizing files, answering basic messages, planning. Of course, not every day could be perfectly designed. Life is messy. But even a small adjustment, choosing one task that matched his inner season, made everything feel less like war. Emotionally, the waxing and waning became a permission slip. There were days when he felt social, wanting to call friends, share, laugh. Other days, he wanted to be alone, not because he hated anyone, but because his inner moon was dark. Instead of forcing fake brightness, he'd send a simple message. "Hey, love you, but today I'm in quiet mode. Let's talk tomorrow." Most people understood. The few who didn't were teachers, too. He realized that many people live in constant guilt because they don't understand their cycles. A mother who's tired but still expects herself to be a full moon for her children every second. A student who feels guilty for needing rest after exams. Someone healing who thinks they must be strong every day. If they could look up at the sky and copy its wisdom, maybe they'd breathe easier. One practical habit he developed was the tiny promise for low days. On days when motivation vanished, instead of giving up entirely or forcing a huge routine, he'd choose just one small thing. 3 slow breaths before getting out of bed. 5 minutes of stretching. Writing one honest sentence in a journal. That was his new moon practice, almost invisible from the outside, but still part of the cycle. He also learned not to idolize his high energy phases. In the past, when he felt good, he'd make 1,000 promises. From now on, I'll wake at 5 a.m., meditate 1 hour, exercise every day, never procrastinate again. Then when his energy waned, all those promises crashed and shame arrived. Now, even at his brightest, He'd choose realistic commitments that his dark moon self could keep too. Sometimes he'd explain it to himself like this: "You're not a robot. You're a tide. No ocean is high all day. It rises. It falls. Surfers don't yell at the sea for low tide. They wait, rest, wax their board, prepare." In the same way, instead of yelling at himself for not always being at his peak, he started using the quieter times to prepare gently for the next rise. Reading, reflecting, sleeping. He also noticed spiritual guilt starting to fade. Before, if he had a week with messy, scattered practice, he'd feel unworthy. A real practitioner wouldn't be like this. But then he thought about monks in traditional monasteries who live with seasons, harvest, weather. Even they adjust their routines when winter comes, when work is heavier, when bodies are older. Why would he demand more than nature allows? And something beautiful happened. The more he trusted his rhythms, the more consistent he became overall. Not perfect, not linear, but steady. Like a moon that always returns, even when hidden. The graph of his life stopped looking like violent spikes of effort and collapse, and started looking more like waves. Up, down, but slowly trending toward more awareness, more kindness, more presence. Of course, seasons still came that were extra hard. Long winters of the soul where energy stayed low for longer than he liked. In those times, he leaned more heavily on tiny practices and kind friendships. He reminded himself, sometimes the moon is hidden by clouds, even when it's technically full. Just because you can't see your light doesn't mean it's gone. Gradually, a deeper question formed in his heart. If his emotions were rivers, his energy a moon, his healing a changing season, then what was the him that could watch all of this come and go? The one who noticed the rising and falling, the light and dark, the freezing and thawing, that quiet watcher, that clear, spacious awareness, began to feel like a deep, hidden well that never ran dry. He kept returning to that feeling. Something in me watches everything else. Thoughts rush, emotions crash, energy rises and falls, but there's a quiet place that doesn't move. One morning, sitting in silence, he remembered the village well from an old story. Deep, hidden, always full, no matter the weather above. And he thought, what if my own mind has a well like that? He began playing with this idea in a very simple way. When his mind was noisy, instead of fighting every thought, he'd imagine himself standing at the top of a deep stone well. At the surface, voices, worries, to-do lists, all bumping into each other like people in a crowded market. But down below, far under the noise, there was only cool, still water, clear, quiet, waiting. At first, he tried to jump to the bottom, forcing stillness. It didn't work. The more he pushed thoughts away, the louder they became. Like children, he was shushing too harshly. So he tried another approach. Instead of chasing silence, he just watched. Okay, he'd say gently, this is the surface. Let's see what happens if we simply lower the bucket. Lowering the bucket became a small breathing ritual. Inhale. I'm at the surface. It's noisy. That's okay. Exhale. The bucket goes a little deeper. Inhale. Yes, thoughts are here. Exhale. Dropping deeper. He didn't try to stop the thoughts up top. He just refused to live only at that level. Bit by bit, breath by breath, he felt his awareness settle. Sometimes it helped to add a physical anchor. He'd place one hand on his chest and one on his belly. Top hand, surface mind, busy, talking, planning. Bottom hand, deep awareness, simple, present, quiet. As he breathed, he'd imagine the attention slowly sliding from the top hand to the bottom. Not perfectly, not all at once, just drifting downward like a leaf sinking through water. On difficult days, the surface was wild, like a storm above the well. Old memories, fears about the future, random song lyrics looping in his head. In the past, he'd panic. I can't meditate like this. My mind is broken. Now he'd whisper, the storm is at the top. The water below is not the storm. Just remembering that gave him a little more space to breathe. He started noticing that this deep, quiet place didn't have opinions about him. It wasn't saying, you're behind, you're failing, or you should be further along by now. Those voices lived near the surface. Down in the well, there was only a kind of neutral, open presence. It didn't judge, it just was. And for someone who'd spent years fighting himself, that neutrality felt strangely loving. To make the practice real, he brought it into small, ordinary moments. Waiting in line at the market. Surface mind. This is taking forever. Deep well, feeling his feet on the ground, the temperature of the air on his skin, the simple fact of being here. Lying in bed, unable to sleep. Surface mind, you'll be exhausted tomorrow. Deep well, the rise and fall of the breath, the heaviness of the body sinking into the mattress. He realized he didn't have to reach some mystical state to touch this depth. It was more like remembering something very obvious that he kept overlooking, like realizing, oh, I've been so focused on the waves, I forgot I'm also the ocean. Whenever he caught himself lost in the waves, he'd smile softly and ask, and who's noticing this? That single question was like lowering the bucket a little further. Some nights, he'd place a glass of water by his bed as a symbol. Before sleeping, he'd look at it and remind himself, my awareness is like this. Even if the surface ripples, the water is still water, clear by nature. In the middle of the night, if anxiety woke him, he'd take a tiny sip, not as a magic trick, but as a physical reminder. The well inside hasn't dried up. The source is still here. He also saw that you don't have to be perfectly calm to live from this depth. People imagine that if they find their center, they'll never feel upset again. But he noticed something different. He could be upset and still connected to the well. Sadness on the surface, quiet awareness below, anger in the chest, spaciousness behind it. 2 layers, 1 heart. This understanding changed how he treated other people too. When someone was shouting, complaining, or panicking, he began to picture their inner well, even if they'd never heard of meditation in their life. On the surface, they might be pure storm, but somewhere inside them, just like inside him, there was a clear, undisturbed depth. Seeing them that way softened his reactions. He spoke more gently. Sometimes he'd imagine dialing his awareness back, like zooming out in a camera. Instead of being pressed up against every thought, he'd mentally step a few meters back and watch from a distance. Thoughts, still there. Emotions, still there. But now they were like clouds in a large sky, not walls closing in. The well, the sky, the space, all the same pointing. You are larger than what you feel. And in the context of sleep, this became a quiet superpower. Instead of fighting to shut off his mind, he'd let the surface chatter do whatever it wanted, while he rested as the one who notices. He'd think, I don't have to control every thought right now. I just have to sink a little deeper, like a stone settling to the bottom of a lake. The body relaxed. The breath softened. Sleep found him more easily. Over time, he stopped seeing the deep well as something he had to reach and started seeing it as something he could remember, like a song he already knew, but sometimes forgot the melody of. Every time he came back, during stress, during joy, during boredom, the well was the same, quiet, open, unchanged. Life moved. The source stayed. And as you listen now, maybe part of you is also noticing this. Thoughts coming and going, images rising and fading, the body gradually growing heavier on the bed or on the couch. You might not feel completely calm, and that's okay. The surface doesn't have to be perfect for the depth to be real. Somewhere beneath all of this, your own inner well is already here, clear, fresh, and quietly inviting you to rest in it. While we gently move toward the final closing of this journey together, he used to gulp his tea without tasting it. Boiling hot, barely ready, he'd drink it while checking messages, scrolling, thinking about everything except the cup in his hands. One day, sitting in a small Zen temple, an older monk noticed this and smiled. "You live like your tea," the monk said, "too rushed to enjoy, too distracted to notice you're burning your own tongue." The monk invited him to join a simple tea ritual. Nothing fancy, no expensive tools, no complicated ceremony, just hot water, leaves, and attention. The kettle sang softly. The steam rose in thin white ribbons, and for the first time in a long time, he watched the entire process without multitasking. It was strangely uncomfortable at first, like his brain didn't know what to do without constant stimulation. He noticed that the tea needed time, time to steep, time to cool, time to become drinkable. If he rushed it, he suffered. If he waited, he enjoyed. "This is your mind," the monk said gently. "You keep trying to drink it while it's burning hot. Thoughts boiling, emotions bubbling, and you throw it straight down your throat. No wonder it hurts. What if you learned to let things cool?" Back home, he decided to turn his daily tea into a tiny, personal practice. Nothing mystical, just intentional. When he poured the hot water, he'd say in his mind, "This is my day, still too hot." While the tea steeped, he'd imagine all his thoughts swirling in the pot. Worries, plans, unresolved conversations. Instead of jumping in, he'd give them a minute to settle, the way you let tea leaves sink. One simple rule changed everything. He wouldn't touch his phone while the tea cooled. No checking messages, just for a second. No scrolling, just sitting, holding the warm cup, feeling the heat in his hands. At first, his mind protested loudly. "You're wasting time." But he kept going, like someone training a very impatient dog to sit for 5 extra seconds. He began adding a small question to the ritual. What is actually here, right now? Not tomorrow, not yesterday, not in somebody else's life, just here. The weight of the mug, the smell of the tea, the sound of a distant car. Tiny details, so ordinary that his old self would have ignored them completely. Yet, the more he noticed them, the less cramped his inner world felt. Sometimes, he'd use the steeping time to gently name his state. Today I'm tired. Today I'm angry. Today I'm scared. Saying it out loud in a soft voice, as if talking to a friend, stripped those feelings of some of their power. They were no longer vague, looming clouds. They were just weather reports. Honest, simple, passing. There were days when his tea stayed untouched for a long time because thoughts hooked him again. He'd catch himself halfway through a mental argument with someone who wasn't even there and smile ironically. Okay, he'd think, I drank the boiling tea again. But instead of judging himself, He'd simply take another sip, now cooler, and begin again. Imperfect ritual, still valuable. He also noticed something practical. This small pause before drinking made him less reactive afterwards. That 5-minute practice of waiting, breathing, and noticing created a kind of buffer in his day. When someone sent a rude message or plans suddenly changed, there was a tiny gap between the trigger and his reaction. In that gap, he had a choice. You can try this too, even if you don't drink tea. Coffee, hot chocolate, even a simple glass of water can become a tiny ritual. The secret is not in the beverage, it's in the waiting. It's in allowing 1 minute of your day to be fully devoted to being where you are, with what you're holding, with the body you're in. No performance, no perfection, just an honest pause. Over time, he began to realize that many problems in his life came from trying to drink things before they were ready, answering messages before he'd processed his feelings, making big decisions in the middle of emotional storms, forcing solutions when his heart was still boiling. Now, when he felt that inner heat, he'd tell himself, let it steep, let it cool. You don't have to swallow this right now. There's a certain kindness in not forcing yourself to resolve every emotion immediately. You can write a thought in a notebook and promise to revisit it when your mind is cooler. You can walk around the block before sending the text. You can sleep on a decision instead of reacting at midnight. This is not avoidance. It's wise timing, like not pouring tea over your own hand. He started to understand what the monk meant when he said, the way you drink tea is the way you live, rushed, distracted, or present and patient. Each cup became a small mirror. On days when he couldn't slow down even for those few minutes, he knew he was on autopilot again, not as a punishment, but as a gentle warning light on the dashboard. On nights when he couldn't sleep, he'd sometimes get up and make a cup of tea in the dark kitchen. The ritual calmed him more than any motivational quote ever had. Just water warming, tea steeping, air cooling. A simple reminder that not everything has to be solved right now. Some things just need time and a bit of space to become clearer. The more he repeated this tiny practice, the more he noticed another shift. He began treating other people's emotions like hot tea, too. Instead of demanding they calm down immediately, he learned to give them space to cool, to listen without rushing them toward a conclusion, to understand that boiling moments are not the best time for final words or big decisions. And so, a very quiet thing happened, without any dramatic enlightenment, without fireworks, without a single perfect meditation session. His days started to feel different. Not always peaceful, not always easy, but more breathable. Because several times a day, he was willing to do something shockingly simple and strangely rare. Wait, watch, and let the tea of his mind cool. Just enough to taste what life was really offering. He used to gulp his tea without tasting it. Boiling hot, barely ready, he'd drink it while checking messages, scrolling, thinking about everything except the cup in his hands. One day, sitting in a small Zen temple, an older monk noticed this and smiled. "You live like your tea," the monk said, "too rushed to enjoy, too distracted to notice you're burning your own tongue." The monk invited him to join a simple tea ritual. Nothing fancy, no expensive tools, no complicated ceremony, just hot water, leaves, and attention. The kettle sang softly. The steam rose in thin white ribbons, and for the first time in a long time, he watched the entire process without multitasking. It was strangely uncomfortable at first, like his brain didn't know what to do without constant stimulation. He noticed that the tea needed time, time to steep, time to cool, time to become drinkable. If he rushed it, he suffered. If he waited, he enjoyed. This is your mind, the monk said gently. You keep trying to drink it while it's burning hot. Thoughts boiling, emotions bubbling, and you throw it straight down your throat. No wonder it hurts. What if you learned to let things cool? Back home, he decided to turn his daily tea into a tiny, personal practice. Nothing mystical, just intentional. When he poured the hot water, he'd say in his mind, "This is my day, still too hot." While the tea steeped, he'd imagine all his thoughts swirling in the pot. Worries, plans, unresolved conversations. Instead of jumping in, he'd give them a minute to settle, the way you let tea leaves sink. One simple rule changed everything. He wouldn't touch his phone while the tea cooled. No checking messages, just for a second. No scrolling, just sitting, holding the warm cup, feeling the heat in his hands. At first, his mind protested loudly. "You're wasting time." But he kept going, like someone training a very impatient dog to sit for 5 extra seconds. He began adding a small question to the ritual. What is actually here, right now? Not tomorrow, not yesterday, not in somebody else's life, just here. The weight of the mug, the smell of the tea, the sound of a distant car. Tiny details, so ordinary that his old self would have ignored them completely. Yet, the more he noticed them, the less cramped his inner world felt. Sometimes, he'd use the steeping time to gently name his state. Today I'm tired. Today I'm angry. Today I'm scared. Saying it out loud in a soft voice, as if talking to a friend, stripped those feelings of some of their power. They were no longer vague, looming clouds. They were just weather reports. Honest, simple, passing. There were days when his tea stayed untouched for a long time because thoughts hooked him again. He'd catch himself halfway through a mental argument with someone who wasn't even there and smile ironically. Okay, he'd think, I drank the boiling tea again. But instead of judging himself, he'd simply take another sip, now cooler, and begin again. Imperfect ritual, still valuable. He also noticed something practical. This small pause before drinking made him less reactive afterwards. That 5-minute practice of waiting, breathing, and noticing created a kind of buffer in his day. When someone sent a rude message or plans suddenly changed, there was a tiny gap between the trigger and his reaction. In that gap, he had a choice. You can try this too, even if you don't drink tea. Coffee, hot chocolate, even a simple glass of water can become a tiny ritual. The secret is not in the beverage, it's in the waiting. It's in allowing 1 minute of your day to be fully devoted to being where you are, with what you're holding, with the body you're in. No performance, no perfection, just an honest pause. Over time, he began to realize that many problems in his life came from trying to drink things before they were ready, answering messages before he'd processed his feelings, making big decisions in the middle of emotional storms, forcing solutions when his heart was still boiling. Now, when he felt that inner heat, he'd tell himself, let it steep, let it cool. You don't have to swallow this right now. There's a certain kindness in not forcing yourself to resolve every emotion immediately. You can write a thought in a notebook and promise to revisit it when your mind is cooler. You can walk around the block before sending the text. You can sleep on a decision instead of reacting at midnight. This is not avoidance. It's wise timing, like not pouring tea over your own hand. He started to understand what the monk meant when he said, the way you drink tea is the way you live, rushed, distracted, or present and patient. Each cup became a small mirror. On days when he couldn't slow down even for those few minutes, he knew he was on autopilot again, not as a punishment, but as a gentle warning light on the dashboard. On nights when he couldn't sleep, he'd sometimes get up and make a cup of tea in the dark kitchen. The ritual calmed him more than any motivational quote ever had. Just water warming, tea steeping, air cooling. A simple reminder that not everything has to be solved right now. Some things just need time and a bit of space to become clearer. The more he repeated this tiny practice, the more he noticed another shift. He began treating other people's emotions like hot tea, too. Instead of demanding they calm down immediately, he learned to give them space to cool, to listen without rushing them toward a conclusion. To understand that boiling moments are not the best time for final words or big decisions. And so, a very quiet thing happened, without any dramatic enlightenment, without fireworks, without a single perfect meditation session. His days started to feel different, not always peaceful, not always easy, but more breathable, because several times a day, he was willing to do something shockingly simple and strangely rare. Wait, watch, and let the tea of his mind cool. Just enough to taste what life was really offering. He used to lie in bed feeling like he'd lived 5 different lives in one single day. In the morning, he was the responsible worker, pretending he had everything under control. In the afternoon, he shifted into the strong friend, always available, never needing help. At home, he became the one who keeps it together, hiding his exhaustion so others wouldn't worry. By night, all those roles were still wrapped around him like heavy coats he'd forgotten to take off. One evening, after another sleepless night, he told a teacher, "I feel like I'm always on. Even when I turn off the lights, my mind is still performing." The teacher nodded and said something that stayed with him. "You try to sleep without undressing your day. No wonder it's so hard to rest." That sentence hit him in a quiet but undeniable way. He realized he had never learned how to put his identities down, even for a few hours. The teacher invited him to imagine an inner closet at the edge of his bed. Not a real piece of furniture, but a place in the mind. Every night, the teacher said, before you sleep, you will hang up the coat of each role you wore today. You can pick them up again tomorrow, but for tonight, you sleep as the one who doesn't need to perform. It sounded almost too simple, but something in him was desperate enough to try. That night, with the lights off and his body tense, he pictured himself standing in front of that invisible closet. In his mind, he saw a thick, formal coat labeled Perfect Professional. He imagined unbuttoning it slowly, feeling the weight of expectations slide off his shoulders. In his chest, he actually felt a small physical release, as if muscles he didn't know he was tightening finally let go. Next, he found the coat called Always Strong Friend. That one was especially heavy, full of unspoken sentences like, "I'm fine, don't worry about me," and "I'll handle it." As he hung it on an imaginary hanger, he whispered softly, "Tonight, I'm allowed to be the one who needs support too, even if no one sees it." His eyes burned a little, but it wasn't from tiredness. It was from truth starting to melt some old armor. There was another coat, more subtle, but just as heavy. The one who never disappoints. That coat was stitched together from childhood memories, school grades, family expectations, and social media comparison. It was itchy and too tight, yet he'd worn it for so long, it felt like skin. Hanging that one up took longer. He had to remind himself, again and again, I'm allowed to be human in my own bed. I don't need to be impressive in the dark. To make the ritual more tangible, he began writing these roles on paper before sleep. Today, I tried to be the perfect colleague, the calm parent, the funny friend. Then he'd fold the paper and place it inside a box beside the bed, as if physically storing those identities for the night. The combination of image and action made his nervous system believe something had truly been put down. Sometimes he'd add one more step. After hanging each coat in the inner closet, he would place his hand over his heart and say, "Without this role, who am I, just for now?" The answer wasn't a fancy spiritual concept. It was something simple. I'm a tired person who needs rest. I'm a body that has worked all day. I'm a heart that has carried a lot. That honesty itself felt like a soft pillow. On harder days, he'd realize he was still wearing a coat even in bed. For example, the coat of the one who must fix everything before sleep. That role made him reach for his phone at midnight, reply to messages, scroll through solutions, watch productivity videos when his soul wanted silence. Learning to hang that coat up meant telling himself, "Enough for today. The world can wait 8 hours." If you want to try this, you don't need a perfect imagination or deep spirituality. Just ask yourself before sleep, which roles did I wear today? You might discover you were the mediator, the entertainer, the caretaker, the achiever, the problem solver. Then, with eyes closed, imagine taking those roles off like coats and hanging them in a safe closet. You're not quitting them forever. You're just saying, "I'll wear you again tomorrow. Tonight, I rest." He noticed that on nights when he truly did this, his dreams felt different, less like replays of meetings and arguments, more like the mind taking a gentle walk through old memories and images, reorganizing quietly. It was as if his unconscious had more space to breathe when it wasn't being forced to keep up the act 24/7. He also became kinder to others. When a friend snapped at him or forgot to reply, he no longer immediately thought, "They don't care." Instead, he wondered, how many coats are they still wearing in bed? Maybe they too slept as the responsible one, the strong one, the one who can't fall apart. This thought softened his judgment and increased his empathy. Over time, he realized that some coats had become unnecessary. A role he picked up years ago, like the clown who makes everyone laugh so they don't notice he's sad, began to feel outdated. One night, standing in front of the inner closet, he imagined taking that coat not just off, but out. He pictured himself carefully folding it, thanking it for its service, and then placing it in a box labeled "No Longer Needed." Letting go of an old role didn't mean he stopped being funny or helpful. It simply meant he no longer had to perform in order to be loved. His humor became lighter, less desperate. His help became cleaner, less mixed with the need to prove his worth. The more honest he was in that inner closet at night, the more authentic he felt during the day. On some evenings, he'd lie there and realize, tonight, the only coat left is the one who is not enough. That one was sneaky, stitched from comparison, criticism, and years of feeling behind. It didn't come off in one try. Some nights he could only unzip it halfway, but even that was progress. Half a coat off is still half a body breathing freely. As the practice matured, he understood something quietly powerful. Beneath all the coats, beneath all the roles, there was a softness that had always been there. A simple awareness that didn't need a title, a job, a label, or a performance. This awareness was who lay down in bed when the closet door finally closed. And somehow, knowing that made the darkness less lonely. And yet, even as he found this deeper place, life kept bringing new roles, new coats to try on. The practice wasn't about never wearing them. It was about remembering that every night, before dreams come and another day begins, there is a sacred moment where he can stand in front of that inner closet, smile tiredly, and say, "Thank you for today. Now all of you can rest." And in that pause, he sensed there were still more layers of letting go waiting to be discovered. He once described his mind at night as a chaotic train station. As soon as his head touched the pillow, dozens of thought trains roared in and out. One carried regrets from years ago. Another dragged worries about money. A third was full of imaginary arguments that hadn't even happened yet. He didn't feel like a person trying to sleep. He felt like a passenger being dragged onto every train against his will. One evening, an old monk listened to his description and nodded calmly. "Your problem," the monk said, "is not that there are too many trains. It's that you think you must board all of them." That sentence landed quietly, like a stone dropping into deep water. He realized he'd never even considered the possibility of staying on the platform and just watching some trains arrive and leave without him. The monk invited him to practice a strange but simple exercise. "Tonight, when you lie down," he said, "imagine you're sitting on a bench in a peaceful train station. Each thought that appears is just a train pulling in. Some will be loud, some will be scary, some will be tempting. But your only job is to notice, there goes the 2 a.m. Worry, express, and not get on." That night, when his mind started its usual show, he tried it. A train arrived. What if I lose my job? Usually, he'd jump aboard and ride that thought for miles into disaster scenarios. Instead, he pictured a metal train with that question painted on the side. He raised an eyebrow, named it silently, and watched the doors close. The train left. His heart still raced a bit, but he was shocked to see he was still on the bench. Another train came screeching in. Remember that embarrassing moment from years ago? The brain loves that one right before sleep. He saw that train too, full of old scenes playing on the windows like movie screens. His habit was to stand up, walk into the carriage, and relive everything. This time he stayed seated and simply thought, the shame and cringe line. Seen you before. The train waited, then slowly departed. To support the practice, he paired it with breathing. Each inhale, "I'm on the bench." Each exhale, "I'm not boarding." Instead of fighting the thoughts, he treated them like scheduled arrivals. They had the right to pass through the station, but he had the right to remain where he was. That tiny shift from fighter to observer began to calm his nervous system in a way positive thinking alone never did. Sometimes a thought train arrived that felt almost irresistible. "You have to think about this now," it insisted. "If you don't, you'll forget, and something terrible will happen tomorrow." When that happened, he made a deal with himself. He'd grab a small notebook from his bedside, write one brief sentence about the issue, and say, "Ticket reserved for tomorrow." Then, mentally, he watched that train leave with his note, trusting it would come back in daylight. Over time, he learned that not all trains were equal. Some were just habitual noise, random song lyrics, clips from videos, old conversations. Others were genuine signals, a forgotten appointment, a real problem needing action soon. The more he sat on that inner bench, the better he became at discerning which trains could wait and which ones deserved a quick practical step before sleep. For example, if a train labeled, "You didn't set your alarm," arrived, he'd get up, set it, then come back to bed. That was like quickly boarding the train just long enough to drop off a parcel, then stepping back onto the platform. No mental journey required. The key was, once the action was done, he returned to the bench. Instead of turning the station into a night-long planning meeting, he started to see that boarding every train had never solved anything. He'd spend hours riding the Catastrophe Express and wake up just as unsure, only more exhausted. Seeing this clearly broke a kind of spell. The brain was very good at making each thought feel urgent, but urgency and usefulness were not the same thing. Many of the loudest trains were actually empty. If you want to try this, you don't have to visualize perfectly. Just lie down and pick a simple sentence. I am on the bench. Whenever a thought appears, give it a quick nickname in your mind. The future disaster train, the ex-relationship train, the body image train. Then gently remind yourself, not boarding tonight. If you forget and catch yourself mid-journey, no problem. Just hop off at the next breath station. He found that this approach didn't make the station silent. Thoughts still came and went, but his relationship with them transformed. Instead of being kidnapped by every idea, he became the one who chose. The station was no longer a place of panic. It was a place of watching. That quiet watching gradually started to feel more him than the trains themselves. Some nights, he'd even smile at the creativity of his mind. Wow, he'd think, that's a dramatic scenario. Well done. Humor took some of the seriousness away. A nightmare train called Everything Will Go Wrong looks very different when you see it as just another noisy machine passing through a station you don't actually live in. He noticed something else. When he stopped boarding every train at night, he had more clarity in the morning. Because he was rested, the few trains that truly mattered stood out more clearly. He could act from calm intention instead of sleep-deprived panic. Real-life decisions became simpler when his nights were no longer filled with endless mental travel. Over many evenings, the bench itself became familiar, a kind of sacred spot in his inner world. Just feeling himself sitting there, even for a breath, reminded him, I am not every story my mind tells. I am the space in which these stories arrive and leave. That realization did not erase his problems, but it changed how deeply they defined him. And still, every night, the station kept working. Trains rolled in, announcements echoed, and the old habits tried to pull him back aboard. But now he had another habit, too. The quiet, stubborn choice to stay seated just a little longer, to feel the bench under him, the breath moving, the body softening. And somewhere in that gentle watching, another kind of train began to appear, one that was not rushing anywhere at all, simply inviting him into the long, deep journey of sleep. He didn't mind being busy, at least not at first. What truly exhausted him were the days that felt like emotional storms, where everything came at once. A harsh message from someone he cared about, a sudden bill he hadn't expected, a mistake at work that echoed in his head all afternoon. By the time night arrived, his mind felt like a sky full of thunder, even with the lights off. On those nights, sleep felt almost rude, like trying to relax while the house was on fire. He'd lie there thinking, how am I supposed to rest when everything is such a mess? His chest stayed tight, his jaw clenched, and his heart beat just a little faster than normal. It wasn't dramatic enough to call a crisis, but it was intense enough that silence felt dangerous. One evening, he described this to a teacher. The teacher listened carefully and said, "You're waiting for the storm to end before you rest, but sometimes the storm takes days. What you need is not a clear sky. You need a lantern inside the storm. The phrase sounded poetic, but he didn't yet know what it meant in practical terms. The teacher grabbed a small candle from the shelf and lit it. "Look," he said, "the room is still dark. There are still shadows. But this tiny flame changes how everything feels. It doesn't fix the darkness. It gives you a point of warmth and focus within it." That was the key, not escaping the storm, but finding a small, steady light he could stay with. That night, instead of trying to force himself to feel better, he asked, "What would my lantern be?" It didn't have to be mystical. It just had to be small, warm, and steady. For him, it became a simple practice. One hand over the heart, one hand on the belly, and counting 10 slow breaths. Not to erase the day, but to give his body a signal. Here, in this moment, you're safe enough to soften a little. At first, his thoughts tried to argue. Breathing won't pay the bills. Breathing won't fix the relationship. Breathing won't undo what you said. He gently agreed. "You're right. Breathing doesn't fix the storm. It helps me hold the lantern." That inner response was surprisingly disarming. It stopped the fight between his logical brain and his emotional brain and allowed both to calm down a notch. He also chose a physical anchor to go with the inner one. On his nightstand, he placed a small object that felt comforting, a smooth stone he'd picked up on a peaceful walk. Every night when the day had been too much, he'd touch that stone and silently say, "The storm is outside. The lantern is here." It gave his nervous system something simple, concrete, and repetitive to lean on. Some nights, when his mind was especially noisy, he'd add a gentle sentence after each breath. Inhale, "This breath is here." Exhale, "The day is over." He didn't try to convince himself that everything was fine. That would have felt fake. He only acknowledged what was true. The day had ended. The body was in bed. This breath was real and happening right now. He started noticing a pattern. On nights when he demanded peace, "I must calm down," the storm got louder. But on nights when he just held the lantern, "I'll stay with this warm point," the storm slowly moved to the background. Worries still flashed like distant lightning, but they didn't own the whole sky anymore. The flame became more interesting than the thunder. You can adapt this in your own way. For some people, the lantern might be a very simple mantra whispered on the exhale, like "I'm home," or "I'm safe enough," or "one day at a time." For others, it could be a soft touch on the chest, a favorite blanket, or even the sound of rain in a sleep playlist. It's less about what you choose and more about choosing one small thing to focus on gently. He also learned to shrink his time horizon on stormy nights. Instead of thinking, "How will I fix my life?" he'd quietly ask, "How can I be 1% kinder to myself for the next 5 minutes?" Maybe it was loosening his jaw, stretching his toes under the blanket, or letting himself sigh deeply without apologizing to anyone in his head. 5 minutes of kindness was a lantern-sized goal, and surprisingly powerful. Sometimes, the storm actually got louder at first when he paused. Emotions he'd shoved aside during the day bubbled up when everything got quiet. At first he thought, "This is making it worse." But the teacher had warned him, "When you light a lantern, you notice more of the room. That doesn't mean the lantern is bad. It means you're finally seeing what's been there in the dark." On those nights, he gave himself permission not to fix anything. He'd imagined that his only job was to sit in a small cabin while the storm raged outside. The lantern was on the table. The wind could scream at the windows if it wanted. He didn't have to go out there. His role was simply to stay with the warm light and breathe until sleep gently walked in and blew the candle out for him. He discovered something subtle. The lantern wasn't only for nights. On difficult afternoons, when messages piled up and emotions surged, he'd place a hand over his heart for just 3 breaths. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just a small flicker of the same light he used before sleep. It reminded him that the storm feeling didn't mean he was broken. It meant his heart was overwhelmed and needed a point of warmth. Bit by bit, he stopped chasing the fantasy of a life with no storms. Instead, he got curious about how strong a small light could be. He saw people in his life who carried their own lanterns, a grandmother who hummed softly when worried, a friend who always took a slow breath before answering a difficult question. He realized they weren't naturally calm. They just had their lantern rituals and used them often. The more he practiced, the more he felt a quiet respect for himself. Not because he never panicked, but because, even in panic, he remembered to reach for the lantern. It might have been a breath, a stone, a whispered phrase, or a hand on his chest. The form changed. The essence didn't. In the middle of all this, I'm allowed one small, soft thing. And sometimes, on rare but beautiful nights, the storm simply didn't come. The day had been light. The mind was quiet. The lantern felt less like an emergency tool and more like a peaceful companion on a calm evening. Those nights were a bonus, not the goal. The real strength of the practice showed itself on the messy days, the heavy weeks, the confusing seasons when life refused to make sense. He came to understand that maybe wisdom wasn't about having a sky with no clouds. Maybe wisdom was knowing how to find, protect, and return to that little flame again and again, especially when thunder rolled. And as he got better at that, he began to suspect there were even deeper ways of resting inside the storm, ways that didn't just hold the lantern, but slowly transformed how he saw the whole sky. By now, after so many images and teachings, his inner world didn't feel like a chaotic junk drawer anymore. It felt more like a house he was slowly learning to inhabit. Not a perfect house, with everything folded and labeled, but a place with corners of meaning, where each story had turned into a room he could visit when the night felt heavy and sleep seemed far away. One evening, his teacher said, "Tonight, don't try to fix yourself. Just walk through your inner house." The instruction was simple, almost playful. "Imagine each teaching as a quiet room," the teacher continued. "You don't need to solve anything in these rooms. You just need to visit them, sit for a moment, and remember what they show you about who you really are." That idea immediately changed how he related to his own mind. The first room he stepped into was the room of the still pond. There, he remembered that the surface can be full of ripples while the depth remains calm. Lying in bed, he would tell himself, "My thoughts are ripples, not the whole lake." Problems didn't disappear, but they shrank to their real size, becoming patterns on top of something deeper instead of swallowing him completely. Next was the sunrise room, the one from the mountain peak. In that room, he remembered how much he used to miss while constantly searching for big meaning. Now he quietly thanked the day for one or two small, real moments. A smile from someone, the warmth of a mug, the way the light hit a window. Simple details that his tired mind had been trained to ignore started becoming tiny anchors of gratitude. Another room was the island room, where he had once been left alone with himself. Here he remembered that beneath all his roles, worker, parent, friend, problem solver, there was a simple awareness just being here. On nights when guilt or self-criticism tried to take over, this room reminded him, you are more than your performance. You're allowed to rest, even if you weren't perfect today. Down the hallway was the river and stone room. Inside, he felt again that he was both stable and flowing. The stone didn't fight the water. The water didn't try to break the stone. In this room, he allowed himself to be grounded in his values while also accepting that life will always change. It's a comforting thought in the dark. I don't have to freeze to be steady, and I don't have to lose myself to adapt. There was also the sun and moon room, where he had learned not to wage war against his own shadow. Here, he let his jealousy, fear, or impatience exist without turning them into monsters. I am the whole sky, he would remember. Day and night, light and dark. All of it is part of me. That simple acceptance made it much easier to relax his chest and breathe a little deeper. In the frozen lake room, he revisited the parts of himself that had gone numb to survive. Old grief, old anger, quiet shames. Instead of forcing anything, he just stood at the edge of the ice and offered warmth through attention. Like the first days of spring, nothing seemed to change quickly, but something inside knew. This ice doesn't define me. It's just where my heart paused for a while. Then came the garden room, where the soil was always busy, even when things looked slow on the surface. In this room, he remembered that inner work is more like gardening than like flipping a switch. Some seeds sprout fast, others take seasons. When he felt impatient with himself, he'd quietly say, I don't need to be finished to be worthy. I'm allowed to be a work in progress and still rest tonight. There was a mountain and valley room too. From the mountainside of it, he could see the big picture, realizing his problems weren't unique punishments, but part of being human. From the valley side, he remembered that his pain still deserved tenderness, not comparison. This room helped him hold both truths at once. What I'm feeling is not everything, but it still matters. In the seed room, he remembered the lesson about humility and time. No matter how much theory he had, real change needed seasons, not shortcuts. So, instead of judging tonight's state of mind, he treated it as just one stage of growth. Maybe my roots are working, he'd think, even if I don't see leaves yet. That took pressure off his sleep, making it less of a test and more of a gift. There was the empty book room, where he realized he couldn't just live on other people's wisdom forever. This room reminded him that his own experience mattered. What he felt tonight, what he noticed about his mind, how his body responded, that was his writing. Sometimes, just honestly admitting, I'm scared, or I'm exhausted, became more healing than pretending to be enlightened. Another favorite space was the deep well room. There, he could sense a quiet awareness beneath the surface chatter of thoughts and emotions. Instead of chasing every idea, he'd imagine lowering a bucket below them into a deeper stillness that didn't come from forcing silence, but from trusting that something inside was always calm, even when the top layer of his mind was busy. There were smaller rooms too. The closet of coats, where he hung up his rolls for the night. The train station room, where thought trains came and went without him having to board everyone. The lantern room, where one small practice, a hand on the chest, a kind sentence, a slow breath, was enough to bring a little light into even the stormiest inner weather. Each room was like a tool he didn't have to force. Just remember, as he walked through this house in his imagination, he realized something important. These teachings were no longer just content he'd listened to. They were becoming places inside of him, safe corners, soft chairs, quiet windows. He didn't need to use all of them every night. Sometimes just opening one door and sitting in that room for a few breaths was enough to feel less alone inside his own head. You can build this house too, room by room, without rushing. Maybe tonight you only visit the pond, or the well, or the closet where you hang up the day. Each time you remember one of these images and bring it into your own experience, you add a little more furniture to your inner home. Slowly, this house of quiet rooms becomes the place where your mind knows it can rest when the world goes dark. And as he grew more familiar with this inner house, something gently shifted. Sleep stopped feeling like an enemy he had to chase. It became more like a guest who arrives more easily when the house is warm, the lights are soft, and the doors inside are open. The stories didn't end his problems, but they gave him somewhere to sit with them, calmly, as night wrapped around the walls, and something even deeper began to call him forward.